Certainly he's welcome. Certainly he's welcome. So what was the news? There was, we heard from Pete that he wasn't gonna be able to join us today. Bit of a shame. We might have one more coming. Or maybe not. Okay, so Brian, the person you're talking about, would they be able to make it in our next session? Is that the idea?
I don't know. I just asked him invited into this one. I actually listened to his lecture class Tuesday mornings. He's like nephew-in-law, and yeah, he said he was very. I did not tell him that we were doing Heidegger. We were communicating about different stuff, and he said, "Oh, I'm really interested in Heidegger." So I told him I was doing this this group.
Great.
And he said he was interested.
Yeah, so I mean, he can get the last self-contained essay if he's around for the next one, and then we'll have our summing up. And after that, we'll be on to the Gilson stuff, but he's welcome to stay around for that too, certainly.
Okay.
And he could, you could forward to him the YouTube videos that are already up there. There's 3 of them.
Fair point. Fair point.
Right, right.
Okay. James rejoining us. Okay. So this is the end of volume 4, part 1. It's a long section. It's got some really, critical stuff in it about Plato in particular. It has a little bit of an anticlimax at the end, as Joe was kind of noting. There's also a little bit of intro stuff that's sort of the first 2 chapters, 21, 22, are kind of transitional to the stuff about ontological difference and then Plato. So if I wanted to diagram out the parts of this, right, it's we start with some transitional stuff about man and truth and end of metaphysics. Then we have the core chapter on the ontological difference, and we'll talk through what he's getting at with that. It'd be wonderful to have Pete here for that, but it's okay. And then being as the a priori, which is where he really gets into the discussion, starts the discussion on Plato. The next one on the idea and agathon and condition, more on Plato. And then idea and value of thought is kind of, and the next one as well, projection of being's will of power, are all kind of trying to tie together the parts he just did forward to Nietzsche again. So he doesn't simply find the things in Plato that directly connect to Nietzsche. And so he has to sort of go back through the history again with the people after Plato to find out, pick up the thread of where value thinking arises in the history, so to speak. So one of the questions there is, how much do the previous claims about metaphysics being Platonism and all this being just the unfolding of a consequence of a thought in Plato, how much does that hold up? And then at the end of all that, there's the last 2 chapters are about the, in a way, going back to the ontological difference question, or the relation of being to man, which way around to think about it, so to speak. The last chapter is kind of an almost separate discussion about starting sort of about the meaning of the word being, but it's also kind of capping somewhat anticlimactically, put it that way, the whole part. The stuff we're going to get into next time, the separate essay, is in a way starting over again compared to all of part 1, but its subject matter is what's the relationship between Nietzsche's metaphysics and nihilism, so to speak. So the point is, don't think of the next section as being just a continuation of where we just ended. It's not part of the same book, so it's not going to be picking up where he left on page 196. It's going to be going over some of the same ground in some places, and fundamentally it's an assessment of how things stand with regard to Nietzsche's metaphysics and nihilism. The fundamental question is, does Nietzsche overcome nihilism, or is he still mired in it, or something like that? Okay, anyway, just laying out the sort of periods in outline of what we got in this section. To me, the meatiest part of that there's two really meaty parts. One is the whole ontological difference discussion and what he's getting at in it. And the second is the whole discussion of Plato, being as idea, and the idea of the good, or agathon. Those are the two weightiest. There's still another section after that's the last of those where he tries to tie this back up to Nietzsche and modern philosophy. And that history is important, but it's important in part because of how much did or didn't happen in the part about Plato. Okay. There are some places here where he's kind of assuming you've got a bunch of Plato under your belt, which we might not have. So we will talk about that too. Did we lose someone? Thought we just lost one of our guys.
Yes, the gentleman who mentioned the
yeah,
professor.
Brian, yeah. So we lost Brian. I assume he's going to be coming back, so maybe I should pause a little bit to give Brian a chance to come back. He just disconnected. I was going to say, so besides needing to go over some of the Plato, right, that he's talking about and assumes you know, I will also point something out about his reading of being as idea in Plato, which is he is very clearly not a Platonist. So there are some things in that discussion which are interesting and problematic. And I can give you a more Platonist Plato reading of some of the same things than you get from him, but it will have to be admitted that some of that is my own take, or forced, if you like. It's not that you're just going to find it directly in Plato himself with sterling clarity. It's a putting together a bunch of things to come at it that way. But we certainly need to understand to what degree, when Plato thinks of being as idea, he is actually thinking towards the essence of being in a way that Heidegger is otherwise castigating metaphysics for failing to do, if I can put it that way. There's part of the understanding of metaphysics here is that metaphysics is something which has forgotten being as opposed to the beings, because it takes the being of the beings for granted and takes the meaning of being for granted and thinks it already knows what that is and doesn't ask questions about what being means. And while that might be fair for some things you find in Aristotle and people after him, it's not adequate to an understanding of why Plato / Socrates comes up with the notion of the ideas, because the ideas are definitely trying to think about being, I would put it. Now, they may still be doing so in a way that Heidegger would regard as metaphysical. That's quite possible. But it's not that there isn't a thought about the nature of being in being as idea. Now, maybe that's just the metaphysical precursor of, just as Nietzsche can think of being as will to power, and Descartes can think to be as to be intelligible, Plato thinks to be as to be an idea. But we have to talk about what that means, because a lot of what that means has been buried over with different reactions to it instead of seeing what the original thought directly was. So anyway, my point is that when we get to that part, I'm going to give you some of my own Platonism on the subject. Okay, so don't see Brian back yet, but there it is. So want to get first reactions. I already heard a little bit from Joe that he was, wondering at the end whether or not he was about to get something else that was going to tie it all together and, give him a more synthetic doctrine of the truth of being or something. And I'm, trying to say, no, you're not really going to get that. But beyond that, first reactions to these 8 chapters.
Well, just to finish up the comment you've already summarized that I did make, it seems to me that at first I really did appreciate his reiteration of the history. I didn't know first this good distinction between Protagoras and Descartes. Yes, and then for him further to stretch up and explain how Nietzsche has these great similarities in principle or in category or in some important way with what Descartes was doing, and therefore he's inside a system, a similar or the same system.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that fascinating, and I could see he was bringing something to a close. But then, as you summarized earlier, when I got to the close, I thought to myself, "Duh."
You were expecting there to be, you know, a larger fireworks show in which there were bigger rockets exploding into wider patterns than you got in the last chapter.
Yes, and a metaphor that came to mind when you were explaining all that, I was thinking about this, is that it's like as you're traveling through space and you discover a black hole, and you say, "Oh, wow, I don't know what's going on in there, and I can't ever possibly find out." That's almost like, you know, how he has led us. We've discovered the important question. And then his contrast with nihilism, which is a similar sort of black hole metaphor. I'm fascinated with this discussion.
Yes. Well, we definitely want to get into, well, I mean, and definitely the last chapter in the discussion of being in nothing and so forth, being as void, definitely will get to that part. But I think it's fair to say that this is not one of those books where the last chapter tells you who done it and gives you the answer, right? This is one of those books where the journey is more than half the whole, right? If I had to pick 2 chapters of the whole thing that are closest to summing up what he's about, the last one wouldn't be among them, right? It would probably be the ontological difference chapter 23, and maybe the second to last 28, because both of those are in a way about the same subject, which is how Heidegger, views the relationship between man, being, and truth. And I have something to say about that, but I want to first get Jim's first reactions.
I think I had some similar reactions similar to what Joe had, in that as it started getting further in, around 27, 28, I started thinking, ooh, he's starting to soften a little. He's trying to, you could see him setting up for, the thing that I guess puzzled me the most, and I don't want to get too far into it, was just how even earlier on, he started to step back from what metaphysics, you know, where we are in metaphysics. And like, I'm really not saying that metaphysics has ended. It's kind of like, I'm like, oh, dude, you've been saying this whole time, metaphysics, you know, and I remember being in time and I'm like, okay. So I felt like he was starting to like, what I wrote here was, Heidegger seems to take a step back from his earlier position that metaphysics as whole has come to an end. If this is the case, is it due to a realization that he bit off more than he could chew on making that claim? So that was the first.
Okay, so first reaction is, instead of the grand crescendo justifying the statement that metaphysics is over, you got something like, well, metaphysics might not be completely over, but it's at least we've shown something problematic about metaphysics, right?
Yeah.
Right, and there's a version of this thought on page 180 where he says, we have up to now comprehended metaphysics too exclusively as Platonism. We have as a result undervalued the no less essential historical influence of Aristotle's metaphysics, right? And then he goes off on that. So there are places much earlier where he says, you know, metaphysics is Platonism, right? And in part that's because he is mirroring Nietzsche's conception of the history of philosophy there, but partly it's his own statements, and there's a related issue of the status of the pre-Socratics, because in the sections about Plato, he says basically, Plato initiates metaphysics, and he says, you know, and a sign of this is that all the earlier philosophy is called pre-Platonic, right? At this point, you're supposed to do a double take because everyone calls it pre-Socratic philosophy, not pre-Platonic philosophy, and Socrates is not the same thing as Plato. But okay, we call it pre-Socratic philosophy rather than pre-Platonic philosophy. But even if the dividing line is Plato, is it true that there's no metaphysical thought in his sense in, say, Heraclitus? Nietzsche certainly doesn't seem to think so. In Parmenides, maybe not. I see we have 2 Brian Nelsons, so he's probably trying to get back in. So the point is, in the purely exterior doctrinal version of things, right? You get these sweeping statements that metaphysics is Platonism, and the history of Western philosophy is the history of metaphysics, is the history of commentaries on Plato, and people continuing with this understanding they received from Plato and did not reflect upon. And then there's also some sense in which there was something glimpsed in earlier Greek philosophy that was somehow obscured by the time of the Socratics or right after. It's not clear if Plato and Aristotle are still in touch with it. Probably they are, but then it's forgotten right after when those become doctrinal and not experienced directly, something like that. Anyway, the point is there's a very complicated set of claims about the periodization of the influence of the Greeks, if I can put it that way. And you're right, Jim, to notice that he steps back from some of those claims here. Sorry, do you have a comment?
No, I'm on 2 computers. It's all messed up.
Indeed it is. You got to turn off the mic on at least one of them, okay?
I just turned off one.
Okay, that helps, that helps. You just learned that the infinite regress is not merely an argument in Plato's Parmenides.
It's Brian and anti-Brian.
It's the third man above Brian, right? That's the third man argument, right? The practical demonstration of the third man argument. Okay, so yeah, so the point is that there's a lot going on there, and while it's easy to notice these facts about the sort of strident original claims about the Greeks and then the way in which they're qualified, it's much more important to track the whys of that than to notice the fact, right? It's much more important to notice what it is in the pre-Socratics that Heidegger thinks is more in touch with an original understanding of aletheia, for example, or in what way he thinks that Plato's thought about the ideas is the definitive founding of metaphysics, right? Or to what degree is it actually not metaphysics until you get to Aristotle thinking of being as the highest genus, which is really more of a characteristic Aristotelian thought than as a characteristic Platonic thought. Or is it even after the 2 of them, and in the sort of later translated Roman or Alexandrian receipt of Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy both? Anyway, I want to point out all this out because the history so far has been one in which all of the emphasis was on the periods, if I can put it that way. It was what Protagoras thought, what Descartes thought, what Nietzsche thought, which was a one-way historical progression without vertical difference within each time, right? Whereas Heraclitus, Parmenides, Plato, Aristotle, yes, they succeed one another, although we actually don't even know whether or not Parmenides before Heraclitus the other way around. But the 4 of them are staking out a set of fundamental positions in dialogue with each other, all of them different from Protagoras as well, by the way, that don't fit neatly into the scheme of one after the other, right? It's more like there's a vertical difference among the philosophers within the Greeks, horizontal difference, if you like. Anyway, so it's not all just a matter of a stratification by time, is what I'm trying to say, right? There are doctrinal differences between them that matter as well. Anyway, just pointing that out. But let's, anything more on initial reactions, Jim? Besides the fact you saw him stepping back from some of the earlier claims about end of metaphysics?
I have a big section towards the beginning where I was I hope we can get into it. And I hope I'm not making a mountain out of a molehill. But he basically says, in fact, in truth, however, it's basically at the end of the first chapter. And he says, in truth, however, there are natural, matutinal appearances of those basic features with which the unconditioned subjectivity of mankind is stamped. But then I'm like, my note was, and I'm just telling you, so I'd like to get into this. Is he referring to truth from Nietzsche's perspective, or his perspective? And that distinction has to be made, because he says in truth as if we're supposed to know what he means by that right now. And truth has been so torn apart and re-put together in the context. And I'm like, am I supposed to just take for granted you mean that in truth and ensconced within this small conversation? So that, like I said, that could be a rabbit hole, or it could be a.
So he certainly doesn't mean only in sort of Nietzsche's sense of truth or in Descartes' sense of truth. He's contrasting the all appearances about the course of history, and he's making a claim about how history actually essentially unfolds. The claim is what he's calling these, these birth appearances are what he's claiming there is that these features are ways in which the fact that we are in the era of Nietzschean metaphysics, that's what you're seeing there. So what he's saying is that all these things, he's not making a claim about his own sense of history, whatever. He's trying to say at the end of that section that all of this is the sign that we are now in the era of Nietzschean metaphysics, right? That's why he says those basic features with which the unconditioned subjectivity of mankind is stamped. The unconditioned subjectivity of mankind is what he's calling Nietzsche's metaphysics, and the beginning of the next chapter is all about that we must grasp Nietzsche's philosophy as the metaphysics of subjectivity, and more specifically the metaphysics of absolute subjectivity of will to power, as opposed to, say, Hegel's. But the claim is that the current metaphysical era is the era of metaphysics of subjectivity, which is Nietzsche's metaphysics, right? And these things, other things he was talking about at the end of the Man and Truth chapter, right, are all of them meant to be characterizations of thought in the modern world that are signs of Nietzschean metaphysics installing itself as the way everyone thinks, so to speak. So he's not saying that is something that Nietzsche is claiming about the world, and he's not saying that it's something in accordance with Nietzsche's view of the world. He's saying the world is now acting and appearing it is living as though Nietzsche's metaphysics is true because it is convinced by the philosophy of the metaphysics of subjectivity. And his example of that beforehand is some of the stuff about the the ideology and power politics things before them, but also some of the ways in which that is being related to the importance given to subjectivity. Now, this is in a way, these two transitional chapters, this previous one, 21 and 22, are making those claims about Nietzsche's metaphysics in part to prepare us for 23, because the point that's going to be made in 23 is, this is the ontological difference thing, is this whole unfolding history of metaphysics having eras, right, is not something that fits neatly inside Nietzsche's own metaphysical description of the world, or Descartes' own metaphysical description of the world. So the way to think about this is he's making a claim about levels, right? The metaphysical view thinks that there's some nature of man that is eternal, that is true in the heavens, and that something like that, and that nature of man determines the relationship between man and being, and determines the way in which truth can happen or appear. In the case of Nietzsche's, it says that truth can appear only as the kind of illusion without which a certain kind of being cannot live, and as error in that sense. But that is meant to be, in Nietzsche, something which was eternally true, even if the Greek philosophers didn't think so at the time, even if they were deluding themselves about it. It's been what all philosophy was, right? So there's a sense in which in every era of metaphysics, there is a claim about the nature of truth, being, and man's relation to being that is viewed as timeless. And Heidegger is contrasting that with his own notion, which is the following. The truth of being has a history. It's not eternal at all. It changes era by era. There exists a history of truth such that in every different era, you get a different metaphysics with its own definition of truth. And the claim is that definition of truth, there's some function of that definition of truth which determines how the nature of man is seen within that metaphysical era. So the truth of being, the unveiling of being, the sense of appearing of being has a history, and what people view as human nature is a function of that history. It's particularly a function of the notion of truth that they have at each era in that history. So that if the metaphysical era changes, that's the same as saying people's understanding of truth changes, and as a result, as a consequence, their view of human nature is going to change. Because people's view of human nature is a coordinate dependent function of their understanding of what truth is or how truth happens. So this is a claim that all metaphysics has too static a view of human nature. It doesn't recognize that human nature isn't just viewed as different, but changes as man's sense of what counts as true changes. Okay, so harking back to the kind of stuff he was doing in Being in Time for a second, he's always telling you things that about the structure of man's existence. He'll tell you that, you know, man is always already in a world, right, which he didn't make, and things like that. He's telling you another existential structure, which is something like this. Man always already has a metaphysics. He has some view of what truth is or how truth happens. His understanding of what it is to be a human being and how man is related to the whole depends upon the view of truth he has, right? And that man always has some understanding of those things is not the same thing as saying he always has the same understanding of those things. He doesn't. Man's understanding of what truth is has a history. So that's like almost the fundamental thing, and the ontological difference is actually about this. As we see in, this is in the ontological difference chapter on page 154, right? Top 154, one might almost surmise and maintain correctly that what we call the differentiation of being and beings we have invented and contrived something that is not and above does not need to be, saying someone might think that Heidegger's construction of the importance of the ontological difference is itself just another perspectival interpretation, act of Nietzschean legislation like any of the other ones, right? And he says, but a glance at metaphysics and into its history soon teaches us otherwise. What's the point here? The point here is that it is the history of metaphysics that he is calling upon to substantiate his claim, right? The claim is that there is some historically invariant structure of relationship between man's understanding of truth, man's understanding of what the meaning of being is, and man's understanding of his own place in the whole, or his own nature and activity. And he claims that history shows us that that is something which moves, all those pieces of that move in a coordinated fashion. And in a way, it's the notion of truth in each one of those epochs, which is controlling all the others. What you think is truth as the appearing of being to man determines what you think the nature of man is. So if you think that that is something which is a function of drives upward, as in Nietzsche, right, you're going to understand man as the rational animal, emphasis on animal, rational kind of a toy. if you're an Hegelian, you're going to think that man is absolute spirit because the animal part is irrelevant, the rational part dominates. Everything truly rational isn't really animal, it's absolute spirit, and you're Hegel, right? So the claim is that it's not that there is one eternal human nature which is determining man's relation to truth or man's relation to being. It's instead that there are different and varying understandings of how truth happens, so to speak. And for every one of them, you get a different view of human nature. Okay, and he's calling that whole thing the fact that man has some relation to being, right? But those relations are not simply an eternal thing. They're a function. It's a variable. He's telling you that this is not a constant, it's a variable, right? Okay, so in that context, the first two chapters we were reading here were trying to establish that in the case of Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche is an example of the world changing because our understanding of truth has changed as our understanding of truth has become a metaphysics of subjectivity, of consummate subjectivity. Okay, and we can talk about the various pieces of that in 21 and 22, but fundamentally 21 and 22 are giving us the transition of he's showing that there's something particular historical in Nietzsche's understanding of truth, and then he's showing that that fits into, by 23, his schema of this historically invariant structure that all the different examples of metaphysics correspond to. All the different. He's only shown three. He showed it for Protagoras, for Descartes, and for Nietzsche, and you're supposed to do the generalization to everything else on your own. Okay. But the thing is, now he wants to ask himself, what's the nature of this structure? What is this historically invariant structure if we say man always already has a metaphysics, what does the metaphysics that man always already have consist in? It's not the particular content of views, because that's changing. What isn't changing about it? The answer is, it always has some way in which man himself is. It's always as some projection of the meaning of the being of beings and the essence of the truth of beings. And he says, the manner in which man takes and gives measure for the truth of beings. And then, the next chapter is going to be about the a priori. So the point is that there's going to be some way in which being is always going to be thought of as the ground or the underlying, or the prior. So, and being understood with these same things. That's, again, part of this unchanging relation, right? Every metaphysics is going to have that in common. In the course of that, he's also, he starts talking about the Platonic version of this, as which he's pointing to as like the beginning of it. The extra mystery he's still on the track of here is, in what way is value thinking in Nietzsche part and parcel of the same tissue as metaphysics, right? How did something like value thinking and truth being reducible to a value arise within metaphysics? How does that fit into metaphysics? What was there earlier in metaphysics such that it could make sense for that to pop out of it, right? So in a way, the easiest way to do that is you could go back and look at, the origins of metaphysics in Plato, and if you found Plato engaging in value thinking right away, he'd say, that's where Nietzsche got it from. It was put in there at the beginning, and it was just unpacked later. But he looks at Plato and he doesn't find that. There isn't any value thinking in Plato. The closest thing there is to value thinking in Plato is there's instead thinking about the good in Plato. That's the place where something like valuation appears at the beginning of metaphysics, the importance of the idea of the good. And a little bit later, where he says, actually, we might have been talking about Plato too much here, and we may have left out the essential influence of Aristotle. How does the Aristotle come in? This is in 27. And it turns out, actually, the way that Aristotle comes in is the power part. not the valuation part being like the good, but the power part, the effectiveness power, the effective or power part is related to what Aristotle talks about as energy or energeia, activity. So he's going to find precursors of will to power in both Plato and Aristotle in different ways. There's precursors of value thinking in the good in Plato, and there's precursors of the effectiveness side of power thinking in Aristotle's understanding of energy and activity, right? So the metaphysics of energy and activity in Aristotle is one side of where Nietzsche gets power from, and the metaphysics of good in Plato are one side of where he gets value from. Something like the claim. It must be said he has not made the connection of the value part to the good in Plato part terribly explicit, and we'll come back to that when we get to the Agathon chapter. He also mentions along the way that the place where the a priori part really comes out is Kant, right? The person who tells you that the way to think about being, the way to think about the a priori is as the condition of possibility of something, that's Kant, right? And he says that that's there in Plato, and it's not Plato, that's there in Nietzsche, and it's essential for value thinking that you think of values as conditions. Values are conditions or power-like determiners of what happens that you have to reckon on in order to control what happens, and that needing to reckon with them is because they are conditions. They are conditions of desired outcomes, right? So there's the effectiveness filter, there's the desire filter, there's also the condition filter, right? That which is necessary for X to result is part of what it means for something to be a value. If it doesn't have a kind of causal or determining relationship to something desired or good for the being doing the valuing, it doesn't count as a value, right? So this kind of prior condition of things aspect of value is really arising in Kant. Okay, so there are elements of what goes into value thinking being possible as consistent with the rest of metaphysics, so to speak, which point back to these various different diverse points of origin. It is not the case that you can get Nietzsche just from Plato. You need injections of Aristotelian energy thinking and injections of Leibnizian appetite and force thinking, and some Kantian conditions of possibility thinking. If you put all those together and spin them off in the direction of the animal part of animal rationale, then you can get something like value thinking out of it within the structure of metaphysics. Okay, and all of that is trying to show that this is, he's not just trying to claim that man always already has a metaphysics, he's also trying to claim that metaphysics is one structure, it's one thing that has a kind of historical continuity to it. That the later positions don't differ from the previous positions in arbitrary ways, but they grow out of it. That they're inheriting things from the structure they're a part of and from its previous history. Okay. I wanted to point this out because there's lots of people who will think of the ontological difference stuff as just being a disconnected from all the history of philosophy stuff, right? You could make a claim about the importance of the ontological difference in thinking about metaphysics, even if you never mentioned history, and you might think that that's what he's doing. It's not what he's doing. The whole claim in the ontological difference chapter is that something that previous metaphysics thought of as a constant has a history, is a variable, changes. Okay. Brian, I want to give you a chance to have first reactions to all this before you start going through all the, I mean, we've already started going through all the chapters, but you have first reactions to this or how it struck you?
I thought it all kind of made sense to me. I was getting a lot out of it. I didn't get the same thing out of it that you did.
Yep.
But I wasn't struggling with it the way I struggled with the some of the earlier stuff.
Yep. Part of that may be getting used to it.
Yeah. But let's see. One thing, I'll be interested in the discussion of agathon, because
Yep.
I thought that was a key concept
Yes.
in my reading. And then at the end, I'd have to say, and this doesn't tie into the way you talked about it, but in chapter 29, I just had a question.
Oh.
Is he trying to describe being without reference to our understanding of it, or what is he says what being is this, being is that? Is his approach to being somehow different from my sense is in the reading this that his approach to being, the ontological approach, is different from the metaphysical, and the difference is that it's not subjective, so that in chapter 29 he's trying to describe being without relation, without relating it to the human understanding of it.
I think that's not right. I mean, he is still relating it to the human understanding of it. He's still relating it to interpretation. There's some parts where he talks about it in terms of language, and then he says, but we have to think not just about the language, but what the language is pointing to, trying to think about the thing itself. What he is, the primary thing he's claiming there is that metaphysics, it wasn't that metaphysics thought about it subjectively, it was that metaphysics didn't think there was anything to think about in being. In Nietzsche, Nietzsche calls being the last wisp of evaporating reality, by which he means it's an illusion to think that there is an eternal being that is unchanging, according to Nietzsche. You know, some people like Aristotle think of it as the highest genus or the highest concept, and therefore it can be applied to anything. And because it can be applied to anything, it is without content, because it can't be used to differentiate any one thing from anything else, because it applies to everything. So it's the emptiest concept, right? Notions like it's the emptiest concepts, notion like it's an illusion, notion like it's the last wisp of evaporating reality, those are characteristic dismissals of the possibility of thinking about being. And he's saying, you should think about being. You should see whether or not you can determine anything about being by anything like a direct experience of being, if you can get one. And also by looking at how different understandings of the history of being, one, may exist, and two, might be important in history. So he's trying to focus attention on thinking about being and the meaning of being, not as distinct from how people think about it, but precisely as distinct from not thinking about it, which he claims there's a lot of going on. There's a lot of not thinking about being going on. There's one place where he calls it an accelerating flight from the possibility of thinking about being. So the sense in which he thinks that the question of being, or the meaning of being, is something that has been avoided in the history of metaphysics, rather than something that has been thought about subjectively. Now, it may be that subjectivism in other senses is one of the reasons that thinking about being has been dismissed, that people have had, you know, subjective philosophy reasons for thinking that thinking about being would be misleading or unimportant. From Heidegger's point of view, Nietzsche thinks of being as a value, and therefore he thinks that all thought about being is fundamentally a projection of psychological needs and drives, which means psychological needs and drives are real, but being isn't. Right, Joe?
Yes. My earlier observation was that being appeared to be like is in the sentence, you know, the equal sign. But as you pointed out, if you have this history of it, a progression essentially through the various segments or eons of the history we're going to have looked at, the content sort of fills up with a prejudice at the early point and then shifts after Descartes, and now Nietzsche's saying we can shift it again. And so even though being is a vessel, an empty vessel, it finds itself carrying stuff from time to time. And is that what we're talking about?
Yes. I mean, so it's supposedly the highest concept. That's one way of trying to understand it. But for Descartes, He wants to be the same as to be thinkable, because he wants to deny that anything unintelligible is. You can make everything that is intelligible if you define to be with to be thinkable, right? So
he says you have to fill the content with that Descartes version.
The point is, at that point, this supposedly empty concept is now carrying quite a bit of water. It has dismissed everything unintelligible from the status of existing, right? So it's supposed to be the highest concept that applies to everything, but guess what? If you put a qualification on it, that's the same as saying, I'm going to dismiss from the category of gets to count as existing anything which doesn't meet my qualification. So now suddenly it is carrying water. Okay, and in the case of Nietzsche, where to be is to be will to power or something like that, he's trying to deny that there is anything outside of subjective perspectival desired thought, right? And he's denying that there is any way of getting outside having a bias, any way of getting outside having a point of view, right? You cannot get outside of history. You can stand inside of it, but you can't get outside of it. You can't get outside of having a culture. There is no outside of having a culture, right? The truly objective, not culturally biased mind is the round square that does not exist, right? So now again, being is carrying water. It's making strong claims about, you know, the biased, motivated, subjectively, you know, spun nature of all thought, right? Just by claiming that, you know, what doesn't fit that doesn't exist. So yes, when we get to agathon, or I don't think agathon, before even agathon, the idea, notion of being as idea, I think we'll also see that there's another way in which to be carries water. Now, Nietzsche's own reaction, Nietzsche thinks of himself as inverted Platonism. He thinks he's overturning Platonism. He thinks Platonism is the nature of Western metaphysics, and that it's or Western philosophy, and that it culminates in nihilism. And it culminates in nihilism because it devalues things of this world, and it devalues things of this world by putting higher value in things that aren't of this world, right? Well, where does it get that higher value from? The answer is it wants them to be not only intelligible but eternal. It wants them not to change. So from Nietzsche's point of view, Plato was also reading certain things out of the category of truly existing because they were affected by the category of time. And if they're affected by the category of time, they were mere appearances. They were shifting. They were uncertain. And the shifting, uncertain temporal didn't get to count as true being compared to the eternal and certain and true. So from Nietzsche's point of view, Plato started this whole water carrying business with the notion that to be means to be always. And that anything which is not always doesn't get to count as fully being. So that was a fight that Plato was having with Heraclitus, and he's still having it with Nietzsche, right? So yes, the ways in which the supposedly empty concept of being winds up having all kinds of contents projected into it, and the result being entirely different views of man's situation in the whole, the nature of understanding, the nature of truth, et cetera, right? All of that is exactly the history he's talking about. And he's saying that a different understanding of the being of the beings is always going to do that. But that's true of the beings, the being of the beings. A being that is affected by the category of time to Plato doesn't really exist. It's the meion. It's the not really being. The things which really are the things which are eternal as mathematical truth, right? Okay, but so yes, and I'm just bringing up again that fact that it's not just there's different notions of content here. It's that among the different notions is how things like change or constancy are or are not implicated in the definition of being. Are things that change beings, or is being defined as the unchanging? Jim.
So I make sure I have this in my head right. So we're talking about Descartes and getting away from the,
Yep.
where we came from there. Is Heidegger trying to say that ontologically the corporeal world and the physical world are two planes of ontology through which we find being? Because mathematics and physics is trying to understand the physical world through measurements, and the corporeal world we experience through sense and touch, and somehow those two are, but doesn't Descartes trying to like make those two things, like you were saying, he made it all in the mind.
Right. So
I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
Descartes wants the intelligible rather than the eternal to be the mark of what truly is, right? And the intelligible is what math and mathematical physics have in common. And the colored wax doesn't have in common with mathematical physics what mathematical physics has in common with math. The colored wax is a mere appearance to Descartes, but the relations of extension governing the conservation of matter of the colored wax, the mathematical physics of the colored wax as a rigid body in space, right? That is intelligible to Descartes. So Descartes doesn't want the perceptibles in the sense of the mere sense impressions, the qualia, to be part of the true being. He wants them to be mere appearances, not true being. But he's not saying that something has to be mathematical to be real. He thinks that the mathematical physical abstractions about material things are real. They're a reality of extended things or a body. But it's precisely the fact that they are intelligible in a mathematical physics sense of intelligible that certifies to Descartes that they are real. You can think about them mathematically if you're Newton, for example, right? If you couldn't think about them mathematically like Newton, then they wouldn't to Descartes count as real. But
And
that's
obviously Heidegger disagrees with that. Yeah.
Heidegger, so real is a different term of art, right? But Heidegger certainly wants being to be something whose multi-voice nature is retained enough that it would include a sense that is true of qualia, illusions, perceptions, moods. All of those have to have some manner in which they are, even if the manner in which they are is not to be present to hand. And the stuff that Descartes is talking about might be the present to hand view of extant things. Fine, we can have a subset of beings for which that is the way in which they are. But he's going to have some other sense and way in which all these other things you can encounter are, where he's not going to be satisfied with that as an exhaustive explanation of being. In that sense, it's his phenomenological method which is driving him. He doesn't want a stratification that will say, because this is based upon some underlying, it is not real and only the underlying is real. The overlying is real even if it is a result of the underlying in some sense.
You see the pronoun he means Descartes?
Heidegger. I meant Heidegger. Heidegger's the one who's Heidegger's the one who's a phenomenologist here. Descartes is someone who would be willing to dismiss the color of the wax as not real because it doesn't persist through. He would call the color of the wax an accident, right?
Thank you. That helps me to understand what you just said in the previous 5 minutes.
Yes.
So would you say that maybe? Was Heidegger trying to say that being might be found in the bridge between those two ways of experiencing things?
He's saying that something like man has some relation to being in each of those ways of experiencing something like truth or ground or the meaning of being. And the relationship that man has to some interpretation of being is not simply the way in which Descartes will explain being to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
the way in which Descartes explains being to you has the characteristic of a single value that can be achieved by a bound variable, right? But the actual thing is, for every different concept of truth, there is another meaning of being and another relation of man to being, right? And that whole, function of a different notion of truth going through history is overall man, not Descartesian man, not a Nietzschean man, not Platonic man, but overall man's, maybe even metaphysical man's relation to being, right? So he is precisely trying to not just make another metaphysical claim alongside Descartes with the same status as Descartes. He's trying to put Descartes and all these other people's metaphysical claims inside a larger functional view, so to speak, that views all of those things as being the variables about which he is talking. And he wants to talk about the structure that they're all incorporated in.
When you say they,
Joe.
when you say they, all this, you said the structure in which they are all incorporated in.
He means the different historical views of metaphysics, the different metaphysical stages. Yes.
Right. In the 1930s, or at least I read that there was sort of a Nazi fallacy about something called polylogism. Different races think differently. It almost sounds like there's an echo there of different.
So that is in a way a kind of how to put it. Yes, there were such things, but they were kind of excesses of the cultural relativism that they got from Nietzsche, right? That was being, if the different subjective needs of your organism, right, project the different values that legislate the categories in which you think about the world, then all of your notions of what are true are in some way or another the legislative acts of your will for what is good for you. Okay.
Doesn't it sound like critical race theory?
Please let me finish. Please let me finish. Right. The point is, all of that is the idea that your worldview is a function of the needs of your meat body. Right. If I now understand needs of my meat body in a very crude Darwinian sense, right, and I have a very narrow view of the species that is trying to be preserved in that, right, then I can arrive at something like those excesses, right? They are attempts to divide humanity into groups with different interests, each of which has its different ideology. The example of that he gave here was instead in the Man and Truth chapter, where he gave the example. Is that what it was? Or the next one, in a metaphysics chapter, where no, I think it's the first one, where he gave the example of is that where it is? There's the third one. Sorry, I'm thinking of the example of the French fleet, right? He's talking about an event during World War II, which you might not know about, but
right. No, I do.
Yeah. Okay. So if anyone doesn't know this, he's talking. This is on 144, 145. The French are fighting on the side of the British against the Germans. The Germans invade France. France surrenders and becomes neutral. They become Vichy France, and they submit to occupation by the Germans, right? The British are extremely worried that they have to maintain their naval superiority over Germany, or Germany will be able to invade England, and they're worried that the French fleet could be the difference between the Germans being able to beat them or not. So they're worried that the French fleet is going to be turned over to the Germans as part of the conditions of the armistice. So they give an ultimatum to commanders of parts of the French fleet that are in the French overseas possessions to turn over their ships to the British or sink them, or the British will open fire. And the French say they will resist, and the British open fire and sink a bunch of the French fleet. So they were allies, 5 minutes ago, but because the British are worried about the danger to their own security if the fleet gets turned over to the Germans, they attack them. And the point that he's making in his discussion of this is that they view their action as justified from the point of view of their own power, right? It is a vital national interest to England that this fleet not be turned over to the Germans. And because of that, they regard it as justified. And he says, every power has its own right and can only come to be wrong through impotence. But it belongs to the metaphysical tactics of every power that cannot regard any act of an opposing power as the latter's power's perspective, but rather subjects the opposing activity to the standard of a universal human morality, which has value only as propaganda, however. Right? So when the British blow up the French fleet, the Germans say how inhumane of you that was, how treacherous to your allies that was, right? But they're only saying that as propaganda because they know that the British were just acting in their interests the same way the Germans are acting in theirs. So the claim involved in this is that in each of these cases, they are this sort of power political view and this kind of propaganda view, and that is part and parcel of this Weltanschauung view of all of our different claims are just tools and weapons for securing our interests.
This is what we hear on the streets today from the left.
We hear from it lots more than the left, right? But the point that Heidegger is making here is that is a characteristically Nietzschean subjectivist way of viewing questions of truth, right? And the examples you're talking about are just examples of that ideological view, right? Anyone who thinks that true is whatever is good for me or right is whatever is good for me, right, is involved in this, right? And Heidegger's point is, to some degree, that's just cynicism, but it's also it has a metaphysical underpinning these days, if I put it that way. That metaphysical underpinning is the metaphysics of consummate subjectivity, right? Okay, so that's the only way in which these things are directly related. And Heidegger is not saying that because this is not an endorsement, so to speak. He's saying this is a consequence of viewing truth as just the interested error of the projecting mind, right? Or making truth relative to your interests. Okay. And he says this right. Subjectivity is not merely delimited from every limit, it is now itself what enjoins every kind of restriction and delimitation. So subjectivity is not something which is set by the nature of man, it's something where man sets all the limits, right? From the standpoint of the later totalitarian ideologies, power decides what truth is, right? And that's the thing which Heidegger was later calling the world of Weltanschauung philosophy, by which he means that people don't even view competing interests as they view different doctrines as different values, which are just the camps of different interests, right?
Hey, can I interrupt with a question?
Sure.
If I think I've taken on board what you said about all these different interpretations of truth, the nature of being, and the nature of man, and they're all related to each other. At the end of the day, does Heidegger propose his own understanding of this structure?
His own understanding of the structure is precisely that it is one historical structure, and man is the creature that is always related to being in this changing way, right? The explication of this structure is his version of a truth of metaphysics. He doesn't want to have a single metaphysical doctrine. He wants to have an explanation for the history of metaphysics as a changing thing.
Okay.
Yes, so he's making a kind of vertical move on the previous instances. He's not just wanting to give another one in the same chain. He's saying we got all these things in a chain. My version of metaphysics is that whole chain understood as historical structure. That's one thing. I'm pointing out it's one historical thing, and he wants to understand that as one of the existential structures of man's existence, right? just as man is always already in a world, or man always perceives a before him in time, and ahead of him in time as the orientation of his goals. Man always already has some understanding of truth, which informs his understanding of metaphysics, what it means, what interpretation of being he has, and how he views the status of man, something like that. So that the anthropomorphism, human nature understanding of each of these things of metaphysics is a function of the notion of truth that they historically had. Now, he does leave open the possibility that there could be a form of thinking which is not simply stuck inside that structure. But as Jim points out, he kind of backs off that claim later, and it's not clear he thinks you can ever get outside of that. To the extent that it is possible to get outside of that, he thinks the only way you do it is by interrogating that structure itself, by thinking about it rather than one of its phases. Okay, excellent question. So, but you also mentioned wanting to get to the agathon, and before we get to the agathon, we have to get to the idea. So this starts coming up in the Being as Prior, where he says, something Plato first approached with measured steps, and he talks about likeness and the abstract, and the first for us as opposed to the first by nature. But it's really in 25 that he gets at the what he takes to be the notion of being in Plato, or how the beings are, being as idea. And then after that, he quickly goes from the idea to the particular idea, the idea of the good. And the parts of Plato he's talking about here, if people don't know, are the sections of the Republic at the end of Book 6 about the divided line, which is immediately before the allegory of the cave at the beginning of Book 7 of the Republic. There is a discussion of the nature of the good, and this isn't just the notion of being, but I'm talking about the discussion of the good and the status of the good as being beyond even being, is in Book 6 of the Republic, and it's the immediate predecessor to the myth of the cave. I will point out just briefly, before you get into that there's a little section later near the end where he wants to give his own metaphor of how you can think about the relationship between man and being, and he offers the image of two banks of a stream, right? And what could flow between being and beings, right? And then he says, let us not allow the unreliability of images to keep us from experience of that, the differentiation directly. So he gives you this very thin image of being and being separated by a stream. But I put it to you, he's not Plato, right? Plato gives you the idea of the good as the sun in the intelligible world. As the sun is to the visible world, so is the idea of the good to the intelligible world. And then he gives you the allegory of the cave and the men stuck in the cave and turning around, etc. He gives you a notion of good mediating between the intelligence and the intelligibles in the way that light mediates between the eye and the things that are seen. So you get these three, blindingly powerful images of on the nature of light and the nature of the sun and the cave of human life, right? I'm just pointing out that when it comes to coming up with freighted images to think philosophical thoughts, and Plato is the master, there's no question, right? People like to say that in Platonic dialogue, the most interesting thing is the myth, which they usually need the image. But let's pull away from the image for a second and ask, what the hell does Plato mean by calling being an idea? And here's where, although he's giving an explanation of this, I think he's somewhat handicapped by the fact that he's not actually a Platonist himself. I think he does understand the Greeks very well, but he goes so rapidly from idea to the idea of the good in particular, that he almost passes over what idea itself means. So first of all, what the heck does idea mean, and what does Plato mean by calling the being of something is the idea of that thing? What does Plato mean by that? Has anyone encountered this thought before, or did you understand it in his explication of it, or from previously, or is it completely opaque what the heck Plato could mean by saying that the idea of something is the being of that thing?
I've always understood this to mean it's what they all seem to have in common, like table. Table is a being in his theory here. So that I see all kinds of individual beings that are tabular.
You're right that it's meant to be something like the abstraction or equivalence that all of the instances have in common, right? Mm-hmm. Which is a kind of logical function view of it. But why the heck would he call that the idea? What is the word idea?
I don't know.
I just learned it. Forms.
So these do get called the forms. They get called the forms. They get called the forms, and they get called the ideas. Why? What does the Greek word idea even mean? The Greek word idea means face.
Face?
Face. The face of things, the look of things, the surface of things, the form of things are the same word in Greek. They are the outside of something. The outside of something is the face of the thing. It's what appears about the thing. The part of the thing you can see is its outside, is its face. They are the limit of the solid. The faces of the polyhedra are the limits of the solid. That is the form of the thing. The exterior of something that contains it, the form of the thing, the faces of the thing, the surface of the thing, the perceptible outside of the thing, that's all one word in Greek, and that word is face. Right? So when Plato is saying that the being of the things is the idea of the things, he's saying the being of the thing is its form. It is its outer surface. It is its shape. As though the substance inside the shape, right, is only some material, but the way that it is formed, that's the actual thing. What makes the being be the being that it is and not something else is its shape. And he's not talking about this just in the realm of its perceptibles. He's talking about this in the realm of intelligibles. What is the intelligible version of shape? The answer is definition. Definition is just Latin for where the thing has its ends. De fini, fine, end. What's the end of the thing? The definitions of the things are the outline of the thing, is the shape of the thing. What Plato is saying when he's saying the being is its idea, the being of something is its idea, is he's saying the being of something is its definition. Definition meaning how it is defined, meaning what are its outlines, meaning how is it differentiated, meaning what is its form, meaning what is its shape. So when Aristotle later will think of the material particulars as being compounds of matter and form, right? The form part is exactly the idea part that Plato is talking about. So Plato is saying that the being of something is the form or shape that it has, which is the same as saying its definition. So yes, it's a visual metaphor when you're talking about material things, but it's not just a metaphor and it's not just visual when you're talking about definition in the sense of, actual rigorous mathematical or conceptual definition of something. To be is to be a defined thing, according to Plato. To be is to have a definition. And to have a definition and to be differentiated from an unformed all and to be formed are the same thing. Okay. So that's what Plato means when he calls the being of something the idea of that thing. And now you can read off why he would say that the changing material particulars are less being in that sense than a mathematical concept or a abstract definition, because that's exactly what's always changing slightly. The thing is always losing a few atoms here and gaining a few atoms there, and its shape is always subtly shifting and it's slightly eroded and whatever. That means its shape is changing, which means its form is changing, which means its form isn't the same as the form it was before. The unchanging form, that's the thing. The unchanging definition, that's the thing.
I've always associated that with Descartes, like Cartesian geometry, if you're going visual.
So Descartes has plenty of continuity with Plato on this subject. Descartes wants everything, because he's also been influenced by Aristotle and the Aristotelian scholastics, wants everything accidental to be dropped from the definition in this sense. So he's applying Descartes is doing something extra beyond Plato by saying anything which can be removed from the thing and it still retains its nature is accidental to it and therefore is not part of the definition of it and therefore is not part of the being of it. So they both agree in wanting the definition of the thing, to be the intelligible thing. They differ in what procedure they're applying to it to determine whether or not it counts as essential or accidental. The essential, which by the way means the being of the thing, that's just what the word means. To be part of its essence is to be part of its essentia, is to be part of its being, right? Essential and essentia, same word, right? So something is an essential property of anything. If you remove that from it, it stops being that thing, right? So Socrates being 70 years old is not an essential property of Socrates. When he was 69, he was still Socrates. But Socrates being a Greek philosopher is an essential attribute of him. If you turn him into a Greek painter with the same name, you're not talking about the same person, right? So the essential properties of the thing are the things without which it doesn't have the same essence, doesn't have the same being. That means it's part of its definition. It's part of its abstractly considered logical space shape. But this idea that what things are in their being is their definition is exactly the thought behind idea. Now, why does this matter? Because in this whole thing, we're talking about he's talking about the differentiation between being and the beings. And the point is, Plato's very definition of what it means for something to have being is to be distinct. To have a definition is to be distinct. So that is very far from saying the most general thing, although it is the most general thing you can say about each of the beings that are particular. Each of them is distinct, right? So you have to look at the generality of that claim, that to be is to be distinct. This is something which is true of every distinct thing, but it's a very abstract truth about them, right? Okay, so that's the thought behind idea itself. Now here's the question. What the heck is he talking about when he talks about the idea of the good and a particular idea of good being somehow above idea itself? Where the heck did that come from?
He invented it. He made it up.
Partly.
He said something has to be something that I look up to and admire in life or in people.
This is not what he did. So the first thing is what does good mean to a Greek even before that Greek is Plato, right? When that guy doesn't have Plato's notion of what a definition of something is, what does good mean to him? Well, good is the thing that souls seek, and especially wise, non-deluded souls seek. That's basically its formal definition. I say formal because it's only giving you something which it must satisfy rather than a true definition of its content. It's a set of constraints that the true thing, that true good must satisfy. It must be that which wise souls seek, something like that. And the discussion in the Republic that starts before all this is all about the difference between that and the mere apparent goods of the other virtues. In the case of justice, people are satisfied to only have the reputation for being just without the reality. But they're not satisfied to only have the appearance of the good without the actual good, right? It's something where people demand that they have the real thing. Go ahead, Brian. Question?
This might be, I mean, I want to get your feedback on this. This was my reading of this point, and it really ties into something that I've been puzzling about in all this material. The thing I kept stopping on when I read this is that sometimes Plato would talk about ideas, plural, and these different, like the idea of the table, the idea of this, the idea of that. And then, in other words, all these ideas are parallel to beings, all these plurality of beings. And beings in their plurality, in their distinctions, are not being in and of itself, being per se. And so it really, when I turned the page from 165 to 166, and it said that being was the possibility of becoming, or something like that, was the condition of possibility, that really struck a chord with me. That's somehow
too far ahead, because you're getting through the place where he's talking about agathon is what makes suitable, which we haven't even got to yet, right?
Okay.
I'm trying to explain how the subject of good comes up at all in the discussion in Plato's Republic, where he's going to explain the idea of the good as being higher than being. The actual claim in the Republic is that the good is beyond being itself. That's the actual claim in the Republic. And
well, my sense is that he's,
I'm not talking about what Heidegger's saying about it. I'm talking about Plato's saying.
yeah.
Right. And the point is that the notion of the idea of the good there is something like what is suitable, yes, but how does it come up at all? So when it comes up at all by the discussion of the good is something that rational souls want the reality of, are not satisfied with the mere appearance of. That's sort of the original function of it. And one of his interlocutors asks, could you be talking about pleasure then, right? Because he knows some other philosophers had maintained that the good is the pleasant, which is also, by the way, the initial subject matter of the separate dialogue on the idea of the good, called the Philebus. But the reaction of Socrates in the Republic to that question is, hush, Glaucon, right? It is impious to even mention the idea of pleasure as the good in the context of the idea of the good as he is talking about it, right? It is impiously superficial, not impishly, but impiously, like without piety. But okay, so what does he actually say about the idea of the good there? He says the idea of the good is in the realm of the intelligibles as the sun is in the perceptibles. Is this famous equation, right? As the sun is to the perceptibles, so the idea of the good is to the intelligibles. And he gives this elaborate precursor that the things which are seen and the eye which sees them are not sufficient for sight to occur. A third thing is necessary between them, light. Something mediates between the eye that can see and the thing that can be seen. That third thing is light. And without it, vision does not occur. And his claim is, in the realm of the intelligibles, the role of light is played by something like thought, something like the emanation from good, right? Good is not like light in the intelligibles, it's like the sun, it's the source of light. So the source of intelligible light in the realm of the intelligibles is what he's calling the idea of the good. Okay, now what the heck is this doing here, right? We learned that ideas are the limit of something, the delimitation of something. What does the idea of the good mean according to the Philebus, besides all these, these other formulas and discarded approximations? It's something like measure, apt measure. Beauty is also part of it. Beauty as aptness of measure. So the claim here is something like, to be is to be limited, And the aptness of a limit to being that thing is the good of that thing. It's something like the adaptation of the exact shape to the function of that shape. So he's trying to get at some notion of aptness itself as measured aptness itself. That's what he's meaning by something like the idea of the good. Now, as I say, it's decidedly opaque Platonic philosophy to see all this in the first place, and Socrates is the first to claim he doesn't claim to understand all of it, and I'll give you all of his provisos up front about how little we understand these things, right? But just as idea itself is something like the idea that things have form or shape, and that the form or shape is what they are, good is the idea that there is an aptness or measure to anything which is a intelligible shape, and that aptness, measured aptness, is something like the suitableness and beauty of a thing, right? Which he's calling the good of that thing. So the idea of the good is something like the pure delimitation of apt measuredness itself. Again, incredibly abstract, right? All of this is happening in the middle of the discussion of the divided line, which is claiming that the things which are most understandable are the pure concepts, and the things which are least understandable are reflections of material things in other material things, like on a mirror or on a piece of water, right? And he says that the area of thought, like mathematics, is the reflection in the sphere of the intelligibles, as an image in a mirror is to the thing it's mirroring, right? So our math is looking in the mirror, not at the things themselves. The things themselves are the pure relationships among the abstract concepts themselves, something like that. Okay, so anyway, the point is, agathon is something like aptness itself, and he calls it the brightest and most blinding of the ideas in the realm of the intelligibles. So it is a particular one of the intelligibles, but it's the hardest to understand of all the intelligibles. Joe?
This reminds me of that line from the poem Ode to a Grecian Urn by Keats, or by Shelley, I guess it was. Truth is beauty, and beauty is truth, and that's all you need to know.
Right. He is obviously a Platonist, right? He's mimicking some of these things from Plato, right? But the relationship between the true, the good, and the beautiful, right? That's the famous trio of subject matters for Platonism. What is the relationship between the true, the good, and the beautiful? So all of this is about this idea of the good business. So a couple things to point out. First of all, this is definitely trying to think about something like what being could consist in. You could call it something like metaphysical in the same way that Nietzsche can think of to be is to be an instance of will to power, or Descartes, to be is to be intelligible, and to Plato, to be is to be an idea, which is the same as to have a definition, something like that. To be defined, to have a form, to be formful rather than formless. But it is definitely trying to think about being in that sense. It may be thinking about it metaphysically, but it is thinking about it. Heidegger calls this visuality, presence is outward appearance. Now, that's accurate, but you also have to remember that all this is happening in the context of a distinction between the visibles as such and the intelligibles, right? All of these claims about ideas are being distinguished from the visibles as such. The visibles as such, the perceptibles in the sense of actually visual, right, are being separated off from the pure thought, like the purely intelligible. In that sense, Nietzsche is correct that there's a kind of denigration of the merely perceptibles as being, the sphere of becoming and so forth. Plato wants to be off in the realm of the intelligibles. And from Heidegger's or even Aristotle's point of view, that means Plato is incredibly abstract. right? From Plato's point of view, it means that he's not mired in the mere appearances of things. But I needed to point that out because Heidegger is calling all this visuality, presence, and outward appearance. Outward appearance is correct, but it's not simply visual appearance. You can't get confused about that. We're talking about intelligible, quote, appearance, unquote, intelligible form. Jim.
I have to pee and I don't want to miss anything. But I'm about to pee my pants.
Okay,
so can we pause for a second?
We can. Short break, and I'll pause the recording. Right back.
Okay.
2-minute break.
A few minutes if the other guys don't come back for another 2, but I'm not worried about that.
Yep.
I was worried that you were, in fact, recording because I went down to look to the record button on my own display, and it says I have to ask permission. But I don't want to make a local recording if you're going to make a global recording.
I'm making a global recording. Yeah.
I think it's valuable because, especially if that professor from, what was his school? I forget again. Anyway, he was, he might like, if he finds the discussion so far interesting, he might want to see him earlier because it's the whole book after all, starting at least when we started recording. Yep. I think your presentations are extremely elucidating. I really do appreciate this very, very much. I've often discovered when I was in graduate school, when I finally realized, technologically speaking, that I could tape record every lecture.
Yes.
Everything changed. Everything changed because I stopped taking notes in class except for the visuals that they were put on a whiteboard in front of me. I had to copy those. Didn't have a little camera and microphone in those days. Mm-hmm. And then I would make a point of listening to that recording again that very same night, and then I take paper notes because I could stop it right down. I can't focus on writing down something and listening to what's coming next. I'm a very narrow focused person, one thing at a time.
Mm-hmm. All right, we have everyone back?
Right. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. Yep.
Okay. I had a question too. I want you to keep going, but I have a question.
Sure.
Well, remember when you were just now when you were speaking about Plato's analogy of the sun and the mechanism that we need to say, okay. It reminds me of the way that Peterson tries to use the hero as a mechanism that traverses between chaos and order. Like it seems to me like there's two realms, and then there's this thing that mediates between the two. Would you think he was stealing from Plato, or?
No, I call that a stretch. I call that a stretch. I don't think it's. Okay. I call that a stretch. Okay, so. Right, the sun isn't sight either, but is the cause. But as its cause is seen by sight itself. That's so. Well, then I said, this is Republic, right? Say that the sun is the offspring of the good. I mean, an offspring the good begot in proportion with itself. And here's the famous line. As the good is in the intelligible reason with respect to intelligence and what is intellected, so the sun is in the visible region with respect to sight and what is seen. That's the famous image. How so? Explain it to me further. You know that eyes. He's trying to say when you try to see things in the dark, you appear blind. But if you look at something in the sun, you see it clearly. Think that the soul is also characterized in this way. When it fixes itself on that which is illuminated by the truth, and that which is, it intellects, knows, and appears to possess intelligence. But when it fixes itself on that which is mixed with darkness, on coming into being and passing away, it opines and is dimmed, changing opinions up and down, and seems at such times not to possess intelligence. That's the way it seems. Therefore, say that what provides the truth to the things known and gives the power to the one who knows is the idea of the good. And as the cause of knowledge and truth, you can understand it to be a thing known. But as fair as these two are, knowledge and truth, if you believe that it is something different from them and still fairer than they, your belief will be right. As for knowledge and truth, just as in the other region, it is right to hold light and sight sunlike, but to believe them to be the Son is not right, so too here, to hold that these two to be like the good is right, but to believe that either one of them is the good is not right. The condition which characterizes the good must receive still greater honor. You speak of an overwhelming beauty, he said, if it provides knowledge and truth but is itself beyond them in beauty. You surely don't mean it as pleasure. Hashkakan, I said, but consider its image still further this way. Suppose you'll say the sun not only provides what is seen with the power of being seen, but also with its generation, growth, and nourishment, although it isn't itself generation. Of course. Therefore, say that not only being known is present to the things known as a consequence of the good, but also existence and being are in them besides as a result of it. Although the good isn't being, but is still beyond being, exceeding it in age and power. And Glaucon quite ridiculously said, Apollo, what a demonic excess. Right? So a little comic relief there. So that's the famous line about beyond being. The existence of things as a result of the idea of the good, not only knowledge of them, and therefore it is beyond being, exceeding it, and people translate dignity and power. The word is actually not dignity. I think Heidegger has worth. The word is age. It's the same word as presbyter. The Presbyterians think that the elders should run the church. But the word age includes the notion of dignity and worth in the Greek, right? Presbyter is the word. But he's saying that the good is older, worthier, more dignified, and powerful than being. Why does this matter? Because Heidegger quotes this very passage, that the good is beyond being, and then says, almost like within 3 lines, that he means by it being. Did you notice this? He says it is beyond even beingness, and he says that what he means by it, through Plato's interpretation, idea as agathon, being comes to be what makes a being fit to be a being. Being is shown in the character of making possible and conditioning. And he calls this the decisive step for all metaphysics, through which the a priori character of being at the same time receives the distinction of being a condition. First of all, it's not explicitly there in Plato that it's a condition. But second of all, he's exactly not calling it being. He's saying it's beyond being. And Heidegger says he's saying it's beyond beingness. With some justice, because the actual word in the Greek is ousia, which is something like beingness, and it's also substance. So there's a sense in which Plato is just saying that the good is beyond substance. But what's the point here? The point here, Plato is giving you an explicit scheme in which above the idea of being itself is the idea of the good, and good is, in a sense, more fundamental or more the ground than being is. Heidegger hears this, tells you on page 169 that the agathon is supposed to be beyond even beingness. That can only mean that if the agathon remains rooted in the character idea, then it constitutes the proper essence of beingness. So he just told, Plato just told him that good is beyond beingness, and Heidegger says, oh, so you mean good is the proper essence of beingness. I told you it was beyond being, and you heard being. And understand, Plato did not interpret idea as agathon. He interpreted the idea of the good, the idea of agathon, as good itself and as being beyond being. And Heidegger concludes that this is the point at which being comes to be the making possible beyond of something. And he concludes this is where that happened to being, not to good. It's almost like you cannot tell Heidegger that anything is beyond being without him hearing the word being. There isn't a beyond being to Heidegger, right? being is the most important concept, and if you tell him that something is more important than something else, he hears, oh, so you're saying that's being. He can hear being as with a capital B instead of beingness with a lowercase b and an NESS, but he can't hear that something is higher than being and think it. There isn't something higher than being for Heidegger. So to me, that's important because it's a place where, in a way, Plato is thinking more metaphysically than Heidegger describes him here, right? He could easily have said, here, Plato is thinking so metaphysically and so much in terms of his image that he needs there to be an idea of something that is beyond even beingness and that is beyond being. And he doesn't realize that beyond being is a contradiction or something like that. He could easily have said that. He doesn't. He just, without even saying that he's altering Plato, hears being when Plato said beyond being. So that is quite striking to me. He says, Plato thinks being as ousia, as permanence and presence, and as visuality, not as will to power. That's correct. So he certainly doesn't think it as will to power, and when he thinks about it as visuality, that's almost correct. It's not visuality, it's surface, it's form. That's what Plato is thinking of being as. Visuality is the place where form and the perceptibles meet. But Plato is only using the perceptibles as a metaphor to understand what he thinks beingness is. And to call that visuality would be as much of a distortion as it would be to say that for Descartes, the visual wax is representation, right? He's not talking about the visible wax. Okay, so, but visuality in the sense of it is vision that informs us that the surface of things, the delimitation of things, is the definition of things. Yes, there he's correct, that kind of imagination-like visuality underlying character of the theoretical is there in Plato. He's correct about that. Plato is a geometric visual thinker that way, in a way that Aristotle is more of a terminological language thinker by comparison. When Aristotle thinks of the definition of something, he thinks of the short phrase that you can put down with subject and attribute ascribed to it as a definition, right? He thinks of the definition as a piece of language in which A is predicated of B. But when Plato thinks of the definition of something, he's thinking of its shape. He's thinking definition way more literally. Outline. You have a question, Jim?
No, I was just scratching my head. I'm thinking a lot.
Yeah. Okay.
What are the implications if Heidegger could miss that, like from here forward? Because it seems like we're on a course and we've just made a little 1 degree, and we're starting to go.
I don't think it's 1 degree, right? I mean, so
yeah, we're about to run way off course.
So there's several things here, right? One is, to what degree is Heidegger's understanding of this historical structure in the history of metaphysics dependent upon him having gotten all the details right of his interpretation of each of the pieces? I don't think it is. I think that his basic insight that there is this historical structure of metaphysics in which, you know, man in each era has a metaphysics, I think that that's sound, even if he got his understanding of Plato off, or even if his understanding of Descartes was, you know, shallow on this point. Most of the basic, most important things about Plato, he's getting correct. But there's no question, he is not a Platonist, and he fails to understand Plato as Plato understood himself, right? He cannot think in a scheme in which good is higher than being. Being is his highest concept, and he cannot move it from that place. So in that sense, he is not capable of understanding Plato as Plato understood himself. he also doesn't go through all this stuff about why Plato thinks of being as idea. He explains to you all the ways in which there are other strains of thought derived from it accurately, but he's giving you a kind of historiological view there. He's not going into the details of what Plato saw and why he saw it and why he thought it. In that sense, he's not reproducing Plato's actual steps. He's describing them afterwards in terms of their impact. And to me, that's partly one of the characteristic limitations of Heidegger. He's extremely sensitive to this history. He's very good at telling you the steps of this history, but he's so focused on change and impact that does he always see all the details of how the thinker understood things directly himself? No. He himself knows enough to emphasize it at times, like when he's talking about Parmenides, he wants to make sure that you're thinking about Parmenides' understanding of aletheia, the way Parmenides thought about it. He knows it's important, but he's not always in a sustained way able to do it for all these earlier thinkers, especially where their fundamental schemas are different from his own. So I don't know what that tells you about how stuck in a structure of his own Heidegger is. He might be stuck in a structure of his own which is different from the description of metaphysics that he's giving, but is one where the problem of being is the unifying higher thing or something like that, and he cannot move it from that place. But it is at any rate striking that he does not manage to understand Plato as Plato understood himself. I think, by the way, he's not alone in that. I mean, you can certainly say that of Nietzsche's understanding of Plato, which is superficial in its own way. Now, there are aspects of Nietzsche's understanding of Plato, like we just saw there, the stuff about the perceptibles and the affected by the category of time and the changeables not being as truly being as the unchanging intelligibles. Both Nietzsche and Heidegger are correct in saying that that is important to Plato. It is important to Plato. There's no question. By the way, he got a bunch of that from the Pythagoreans before him. He wasn't the person who invented the idea that the things which are affected by historical change are not truly intelligible. That came from the Pythagoreans. It was a part of their mathematical doctrine, that the math was better, it was more fully knowable than the things that change, and it was a place where they disagreed with what they called the physicists, the Heracliteans. But anyway, that's just explaining that there's variety among the Greeks themselves. Okay. So he wants to get at the question of why these things are the a priori, why they're the why the prior is the question, right? So first of all, was the problematic of the prior clear to everybody? Do you understand why he was going to the question of the a priori at all, or was that obscure?
He wants to make sure your foundations and what they are, what your assumptions are before you go into what's built upon those, correct?
Well, but it's not simply assumptions, right? So the claim is that there's a question of the priority of things in the sense of this is it first came up when he was talking about are the ideas abstractions from the particulars, right? And the thought you get in Plato and Aristotle is that the material particulars are the things which are first for us, but from the standpoint of nature itself, the concepts or ideas that cause them may be first by nature and second for us, where for us means in the direction of how we think about them or our perception of them or when we break them down, right? And there's this common claim that he's right about in both Plato and Aristotle that first for us in the order in which we think about things, and first by nature in the way in which the thing was made or how it actually works inside or something like that, don't have to be in the same order, right? And characteristically, they're in the opposite order. We start with a whole variety of material, of not even material particulars, but of just perceptions. And we unify those perceptions into a few stable material particulars, and we take those stable particulars and we find the unifying things in them. And in this way, we're having to decode a stream of impressions of the world, right? And the invariants that we find in that decoding, right, are later than the stream for us, right? First comes just the stream of impressions, then come the qualia, then come the way we factor the qualia into persistent patterns, then the persistent patterns themselves and their changes in evolution and influence on each other, right? So we're only after multiple levels of abstracting and drilling down do we arrive at things that move about, influence each other, and change, that are stable things like that. That order of our decoding is what they mean by prior for us. Prior for us is something like sense data, right? But the claim is that as we think about things that way, nature is actually working in the opposite way, in the opposite direction. It actually has some underlying real things that are running around and bumping into each other that are sending off, interactions with the world that hit our senses, that are turned into our sense perceptions. So there's a sense in which the causality of our decoding the world and the causality of the world producing the signals that we are decoding have to be equivalent to each other, but opposite in direction, right? We can only go from our sense impressions back to a thing which caused them and the underlying nature of that thing in that direction, because the unfolding of the process of the things emitted by the world to our senses go in the other direction. They come from some real thing. They emit, photons that turn into qualia for us that we decode in these ways, right? So there's this earlier thought, Plato and Aristotle thought, that the order of events from us as we climb the chain of abstractions is climbing back toward how the thing actually works inside, right? So last for us in our chain of deduction and first for nature in producing the thing that we perceived are the same to them. That, by the way, is part of why Nietzsche doesn't like them, right? Because they're putting this true world that was created out of your deductions and abstractions behind the real world as its supposed producer, right? Which means that they're trying to get beyond the changing surface phenomena of things, right? And to Nietzsche, you can do that, but you're always guessing, and it's always a biased thing, and you're always distorting the thing when you're doing that. And you should pay attention to the fact that you're doing that. You should know that you're the one doing it, and that it's not nature that's doing that, it's you, right? So that's one of the ways in which Nietzsche disagrees with the Socratics, disagrees with the Plato's and Aristotle's. But so how is that getting us towards priority, right? There's the question of what generates our understanding of things on the side of the way things actually are. And as soon as you have any true worldview, like all the Socratics do, like Descartes does, you think that the true world is generating the impressions, and it has to have some way it actually works. And all of that is going to be late in your order of abstractions about things, late in your generalizations, not the surface of things. Okay. So, but we're steering towards the idea of condition of possibility, right? And partly that's because there's a fundamental linchpin along this whole history after Descartes and before Nietzsche, which is Kant. Kant is the guy who tells us that the conditions of the possibility of experience are also the conditions of the possibility of the objects of experience, something like that. The point is, there's a thought in Kant that there are things about the perceives that are true across all the perceives, which are not part of the perceives, they're part of our mind, right? They're not in the nature of things, they're in the nature of our receiving apparatus. They're in the nature of how we're programmed to think about things, of how we're programmed to put things together. And that's the fundamental thought in Kant, is that the things which unify our perceptions are built into our way of thinking, even if they're not there in the things themselves, right? So in a sense, some of the structure of the world is simply the structure of our minds, not in the world. And that's like the fundamental thought in Kant. And it's the way in which Kant is the originator of the modern versions of subjectivity that you get in people like Hegel and Nietzsche. Because what Hegel and Nietzsche are doing is they're taking that thought and they're saying, yeah, but it's not one unchanging nature of our mind there. It's an unfolding series of our acts as well. But in Kant, it is a structure. It's just, you can only think about objects with the imagination because you are forced to project all of your experiences into 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time, right? And it doesn't matter if there actually are 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time. You're programmed to view view and organize all your essential experiences that way. That's built into the structure of the mind. It cannot think otherwise, right? So those are examples of structures that Kant says are there in the nature of the understanding, whether they're there in the real world or not, right? And that move of seeing these subjective structures as possibly being reflections of the structure of the mind rather than of the world is characteristic of this post-Kantian idealistic move, so to speak. Okay, and that mechanism is conditions of possibility, right? Kant asked, what are the conditions of the possibility of this experience? And among them is not just that the thing have this fact true about it, but also that the mind have this fact true about it. Because the experience is a commerce between the events in the world and the mind perceiving them. It's not coming from one or the other. It's coming from a commerce between them, and it has requirements on both sides. That's Kant's thought. So the structure of that thinking is to think in terms of the conditions of possibility of X. Just as Descartes asked of anything, what can I change about it without while it still is the same thing? That's an accident, I can throw it out. Kant said, what are the conditions of the possibility of this thing still being an X or appearing as X? And he doesn't look in the appearances for the thing which appear, he looks in the appearances for the conditions of the possibility of that experience having occurred, right? And he wants to reason from the experiences or the perceptibles back to the conditions of the possibility of that experience. So that's the way in which this thought in the direction of the a priori can not only take you back towards the nature of the things that generated them, it can also take you back towards the nature of the mind that projected them, or that categorized them that way. So this a priori question, this priority question, is what's fundamental, what's generating the other things built upon it. And one of the answers to that can be the human mind as the subject that is having the experiences. So Heidegger is trying to find out where this subjectivity stuff came in that history of philosophy. And he goes back and he looks at the idea of the good in Plato, and it's not there yet. And he looks at the idea of energy in Aristotle, and it's not there yet. And it's starting to be there in Descartes, and it's kind of already there in the notion of appetite and force in Leibniz, but it's definitely there by the time you're at Kant, where he's already explicitly thinking about conditions of possibility as things about the mind, not about the world, right? So in that sense, the hinge of where you get this subjectivity of the priors is Kant. And I think that that's accurate. I think that's an accurate reading of the history as to where that particular subject pole that you have in Nietzsche came from. That the power piece came from is already there in Aristotle, and that the appetite and force things are already there in Leibniz, are a little bit thinner, but that conditions of possibility thinking is definitely coming with Kant, I think is accurate. Okay, questions about any of that? None.
Well, thinking is going on, but no well-formulated question as of yet.
I have a question.
Go.
Does Kant try to tease out those parts of experience that are made possible by the thing and those parts of experience that are made possible by the mind?
To a degree, right? But yes, to a degree. But he's going to come down on the line that two different things. One, that we can know relations among phenomena, not the thing in itself. Point one. But second, and more critically from his own point of view, that it is precisely with things we can imagine, with the physical world and material particulars, that we can trust the programming of our mind, whereas when we try to think about things for which we do not have an object, we should expect the mind to fail, right? The fundamental thing that Kant is trying to do here is he's trying to save something like Newtonian physics while not allowing something like natural theology or metaphysics. He wants to claim that when we're reasoning in physics, we're running with the grain of the programming of our mind to imagine material particulars in a way that is the structure of our mind is designed to think of them. The world of extension in Descartes' point of view, right? And the claim is that the programming of the mind is sufficient for understanding that domain. But that when we do not have a material particular object to guide our intuition, the understanding is not reliable. And he gives a famous series of what he calls the antinomies of pure reason, of these 10 different questions where the mind can convince itself that X is true and not X is true, depending on how it starts the reasoning. And those are questions like, is the world have a smallest possible things, or is it infinitely divisible? Does the world have a beginning in time, or is it eternal? Things like this. And he gives a list of a bunch of these, and the claim is that for those kinds of things, because we do not have a material particular to guide our intuitions, the understanding is unreliable and readily errs. So he's trying to make a distinction between the sphere in which reason is reliable and where it is not, and it's fundamentally going to divide between what we would now call physical positivism thinking on the one hand, where it's reliable, and something like metaphysical questions on the other hand, where supposedly it's not. So that's where Kant is trying to go, if that helps.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Would then the function be S and X be an object? So a function is of S. Function is S, and then X is the object, and the function would be the way we perceive it. But the object itself, then, if someone later verifies its existence empirically, there's also an SX on their side. But the problem is that their S is the same as our S, and that there's a perception and interpretation going on with the data that they retrieved via empiricism. Is that if so?
And not simply empiricism, but I mean he thinks that both these things are happening with the phenomena, not with the object, not with the X, but with the what the senses have already extracted about X. But where those things are in the realm of the imagination, where it is sensual particulars, he thinks that the understanding is reliable. Now, people have found fault with some of his arguments to that since then, but does the fact that you have this intuition about time mean that you can trust your intuition about time, for example? Kant thinks the answer is yes, and plenty of people later think the answer is no, right? But from his point of view, if you've got enough of the background of 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time as the thing that you are having your intuitions about, then the understanding is reliable. And he wants that to be part of the claim that something like mathematical physics is not only possible, but is trustworthy, right? Even though it's only telling you about phenomena, it's only telling you about observations and experiences, it's not telling you about things in themselves. But this is his attempt to find a sphere safe from skepticism of the Humean variety, so to speak. But at the same time, he's going to try to claim that things like metaphysical thinking won't work that way, because you don't have a sensual object to guide your intuition. If you don't have a sensual object to guide your intuition, you can reason about it in ways that will appear certain to you, but can arrive at contradictory conclusions. You can start from premises that appear intuitively obvious to your mind and arrive at X, and start from other premises that also appear just as intuitively obvious to your mind and arrive at not X. You know, and the paradoxes of infinite divisibility are a perfect example of what he's talking about there. You know, Zeno's paradox kind of questions. Okay, Brian, you had a question.
Oh, I did ask my question, didn't I?
Probably. James asked one, and I couldn't tell if you were trying to ask one before James asked his, but okay.
There's some thought. I mean, just following up on your comment, but these are crazy ideas. So in the area where there's you know, that we don't have the in Kantian's concept.
Yes.
You're taking his framework. I think it seems to me what he's also saying is if it leads to contradiction, then neither one of them can be true, or only one can be true, or they both can be true. What is?
He's not claiming. He's not claiming that. He's claiming that human reason is not reliable in the sphere in which it does not have such sensuous intuitions to guide it. Right. The human mind is so constructed as to be reliable only in the sphere of the understanding where it has objects. Now, this is I've butchered Kant slightly because this is the first critique. This is the critique of pure reason, where he's talking about how we reason about material particulars, especially. In the second critique and the third critique, he also talks about questions of morals and questions of practical reason and questions of aesthetics. And he does think that it is possible to have reliable reasoning about those subjects too. It's just in a different way and more limited than in what it can arrive at than in the sphere of material understanding or the understanding itself. So I'm simplifying Kant because he's got a complicated overall position and he's trying to save a few things for the realm of reason, the biggest one of which is something like mathematical physics, but the second one of which is something like rational morals, and the third of which is something like a rational theory of aesthetics or something like that. And he wants all three of those to be possible for reason, but conspicuously not part of them is metaphysics or natural theology, both of which are, you know, argued to be delusory. In this way, Kant is a kind of predecessor of the later positivists who thought that only scientific knowledge is genuine knowledge, and things which aren't scientific, you know, cannot claim to be known. Right? He was trying to delimit, not as sharply as they do in some respects, because they would probably put morals in the same category, but he was trying to delimit the area of competence of human reason. And he called that whole attempt critical philosophy, distinguishing it from dogmatism, which thought that human reason was competent in all areas, and skepticism, which thought it was competent in no areas. To him, criticism is the golden mean between skepticism and dogmatism, where you recognize some spheres in which reason can be trusted and others where it cannot. But yeah, this is all just characterizations of Kant. From the standpoint of the history, what's critical in all that is that in doing so, Kant brought out this notion that there are things which appear to be invariant truths about the world, which are just put there by the human mind, right? And that was an idea that was run with by Hegel and after Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, right? Because they think the sphere of such things is way wider than Kant thought it was. And to the point where they think that the structure of the world was put there by the human mind. Or that in the case of Hegel, that we live in the world of our we live in the world of our unconscious creations of the structure of the world. And in the case of Nietzsche, we live in the falsehood that our mind is projected into the world for the sake of our ends. But both of them are starting from the fact that there is a way in which something which appears to be a structure of the world is just a reflection of the structure of the mind.
I had a quick question.
Yes.
So then, when would the term to exist? At one point in classical philosophy, wasn't that like only human beings exist? Like in a sense,
not in classical
like now
philosophy. Not in
When
classical.
did it? How did it change over time? Because I think that the way Kant's speaking about existence is that different than, like how would I put it? And I'm probably wrong. Existence was something that people had.
Exist is a term of art among existentialists, and they use it differently than earlier philosophy, right? But
Okay.
certainly to earlier scholastic philosophies, they would not say that exist only applies to minds or to human beings, right?
Okay.
But
Right.
existentialists specifically use to exist as opposed to be extent as a term of distinction. And they will say, consciousnesses exist, whereas billiard balls are extent. And those are not the same thing. There's
And that's
also
where the distinction between the corporeal world and the physical world happened?
No. These are not distinctions
Okay.
between corporeal and physical, right? It's a separate, different, later distinction. There's another earlier distinction between to exist and to subsist, which goes back to the ancient world and specifically to the Stoics. And for them, something subsists if it requires an underlying something else more basic than it as its substrate for it to appear or to happen. So they would say that the colors of the objects subsist. They don't exist. The object exists, but the colors of the object subsist, the Stoa would say. They're trying to distinguish between something which is an underlying and something which is a mere epiphenomena or an abstraction that depends upon that underlying for its ability to be. And they use the term subsist for whatever is in the latter category. And they distinguish between what subsists and what exists. That's an old Stoic distinction. But lots of different schools of thought are using these terms in different technical ways throughout the history. The one that you're thinking of, where exist is something like a term restricted to consciousness, is characteristic of the existentialists, especially the 20th century existentialists only. People like Heidegger, but also people like Sartre, for example. It's not really used that way yet in Kierkegaard and the sort of proto or pre-existentialists. But that's not the way it's used in Kant, for example. It's not the way it's used in Descartes, for example. To Descartes, to exist is to be thinkable, right? And to plenty of positivists in the 20th century, to exist is to be countable, right? And I don't even mean countable as opposed to uncountable. I mean something like, to be the possible object of a logical quantifier, and a backwards E or an upside down A there exists or a for every, right? That's what they mean by exist, because they want it to be a function of logical operations or something like that. And that means it has to be something that can be, it's instanceable, right?
Yes.
But and the shorthand for that is sometimes used is that to be is to be countable. But something you can count 1, 2, 3, 4. But
got it.
Anyway, there's different notions of what exists means. Heidegger, in Being in Time, is definitely using exists in the existentialist sense, but he especially uses that of Dasein.
Yep.
Yeah, but that's not the notion of exist that you find in most of these earlier thinkers. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about the nature of man question, right? I talked about this a little bit at the beginning, where and this is so why does he keep coming back to anthropology and the nature of man question? Part of it would be because everything he's talking about here as this structure of metaphysics, there's a kind of philosopher in the early 20th century who would say, oh, this is part of your philosophical anthropology. You're telling me your doctrine of what man is like. You're saying man is the creature that has metaphysical views. It's part of your philosophical anthropology. So you're just trying to describe to me something about human nature. I'll put it in my category of facts about human nature alleged by various philosophers over the years, and I'll put it in the philosophical subsection of my anthropology textbooks. Right? Right? So that's the claim he is dealing with here. And when I say claim, I mean categorization of what he is doing. Right? So there's a question: is this whole philosophical history just sets of facts to be enumerated in the historical sciences of man? Right? And he's kind of expecting half the audience to want to think of everything he is doing that way. And he does not think of what he is doing that way. Why? Because that way of thinking assumes that, first of all, there is a nature of man or an essence of man which is already known and about which various facts then perhaps in addition obtain. As though we already knew what man is and already knew what defined man, and we only needed to have a few extra experiments or observations, ticketing and sorting additional factoids about him, right? All of which assumes that human nature is a single, constant, unhistorical, underlying, unchanging thing about which we can indifferently collect observations, right? That to him is precisely the metaphysical view of the nature of man. You already know that man is a rational animal. You've already decided that rational animal is what men are, and you therefore you are interested in phenomena of rationality as one aspect of man, and phenomena of animality in man as the other aspect of man, and all of them go together into defining man in this constant, unvarying way. And what he's claiming instead is the essence of man has a history. The constant about man's essence is that man is always somehow related to being, or man always tries to interpret being and interprets it differently. But something like philosophy is changing man's relations to being through time. He's claiming something like human beings don't have a nature, they have a history. And what they are is decided by human beings committing acts of thought in conversation with the universe and with being, of course, but through time. So, you know, to use a line out of Nietzsche, man is the unfinished animal. He's not even an unfinished animal. Man is unfinished. And what he's going to be is the subject of his historical decisions. So Heidegger wants what man is to be an open unknown, where it's not just unknown because it hasn't been discovered yet, but it's an open unknown because it has a future. So that's the way he's trying to differentiate what he is doing in pointing out these structures that man's understanding of being puts him in. He's trying to distinguish that from this kind of human nature anthropology view of what he's doing. From his point of view, what man's relation to being is will be subject to the future historical decisions of future thoughtful philosophers who think about the question of being. The constant in that will be that man is related to being in the sense that man is the being that understands being, or tries to understand being, or has some understanding of being. That's it, right? The rest of it is going to be up to what happens next in philosophy, right? Descartes is not going to decide what is true for all time and constrain the future of philosophy, nor is Nietzsche, nor is Heidegger. the future of philosophy is going to change our understanding of truth and our understanding of relationship between man and being. And it's going to do so especially if we pay attention to the previously overlooked or forgotten or shunted aside questions about being and man's relation to being. But he fundamentally is getting at this kind of historical unknownness of the future of the matter, right? And he puts this in terms of, you know, this either ors, which he says are not the whole thing, but is the differentiation grounded in the nature of man, or is the nature of man grounded in the differentiation, or is even this either or inadequate? What he's trying to say there is, it's not that there's a human nature that is grounded in the ontological difference. It's that thinking about the ontological difference grounds what passes for human nature in a given epoch. All we know here is that we are talking at the bottom of page 184. All we know here is that we are approaching a domain, or perhaps only the frontier, of a decisive question which philosophy hitherto has shunned. We suspect, perhaps, that behind the confusion and noise broadcast by the problem of anthropomorphism looms the decisive question, which, like every question of its kind, conceals in itself a particular abundance of questions linked to it, and he gives a bunch of those questions. But he's continually calling these decisive questions. And the note you have to hear in it when Heidegger is talking about something being decisive, it's not that he's saying it's important. It's not that he's saying it's more important than something else. It's that it has the character of decision, meaning an uncertainty that is subject to future human thought, to future human acts. We will decide, is what he's trying to say. When he's calling something decisive, he means we're going to think about it and come to some decision on the matter, and that is going to shape subsequent history. That is what decisive means for Heidegger. It means the function of an unknown future decision, and therefore, at the moment, indeterminate. And that seeing there being something historically open about human life itself that depends upon human thought itself is characteristic of Heidegger, right? It's characteristic of why he's an existentialist and why he is an historical thinker, right? Human beings are going to think something and it is going to change their future, because human beings are thoughtful time pilots, deciding what their future possibilities are, realizing some of them and excluding others. Right, back to the anthropology of being and time. Okay. All right, do we want to talk about the last chapter in the being as void and as abundance, and potato bugs and Goethe? Did you guys understand the Goethe poem?
Not really, but let me look at it again.
This is on
Remind
page,
me of the poem earlier
yeah, this,
in the book.
Yep, page
oh
number.
yes, page 190, right? So the previous one with the above the peaks, right, that
Yep.
you're thinking of from volume 3 was Hölderlin, and this one is instead Goethe. And Hölderlin is way more mystical than Goethe, right? Goethe is like an enlightenment pantheist, right? Whereas Hölderlin is much more of a mystic. But this is on 190. The above all peaks is repose. In the treetops you trace scarcely a breath. The songbirds are silent in the wood. Only wait for soon. You too will repose. And in the German, you can see up above, the last line is Ruhest du auch. It's more like repose you too, right? The last thing is the two, and the second last thing is the you, right? So this is apparently something, he was hiking in the mountains and he scrawled this in pencil on this on the wooden frame of a hut and left it there, and nobody erased it. And he came back there, 50 years later and saw his youthful poem still there, and was moved by it and wrote about it, right? But and he says, what had gone well returned to me, it cheered me, and what had gone awry was forgotten and overcome. But this is just his own reflection on coming back to see the poem he scrawled 50 years after he first wrote it. But the content of it is about something like seeing a still natural scene and peace in that still natural scene, and the thought at the end of it is you too will repose. But the opening lines, above all peaks is reposed, über allen Gipfeln ist Ruhe. The ist Ruhe is the part that catches Heidegger's attention. It's just a repose is, right? It's not even, we turn the order around, is repose in English, but it's repose is. It's not someone does something predication, so it's the essential, the existential version of the use of is in predication. You're not saying A is B, you're saying A is, right? And that's what catches his attention. And the thing which is not a noun, it's repose. Something like a happening, a mood, even an absence of happening. Repose is the kind of happening that is an absence of happening. Anyway, that go ahead, Joe.
If he's saying A is, how is that distant or different from the claim A is A?
Because he's not predicating something of it in a timeless space. He's impresenting it as a happening now.
Okay,
right?
Clear. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And it's exactly that, temporal, the event of A-ness is happening now, that catches Heidegger's attention as the meaning of being that he wants here, as opposed to all the others he's enumerated. All the more, the cup is silver one, so meaning it's made out of silver, right? Repose is not saying the present is made out of repose, like the cup is made out of silver. It's saying the event of repose is transpiring. Okay, so anyway, that's in a way his favorite example of the sense of being that, as he says, no paraphrase will work here. The same is speaks simple and irreplaceable, right? So his point there is that for all these different senses of being, we know how to use the word that way, and it is both unimportant what it says to us, easily says it to us, we easily grasp it, but there's something a bit vague about what we're grasping, right? And in this one, the vagueness of what we are grasping is almost essential to it. It needs an all-embracing, encompassing vague, as the opposite, at the opposite pole of a specific predication of a particular property to a particular subject, right? And that's what makes it poetic, in a way. That's what gives it its poetic generality and power, is that indifferent subjectless happening sense of being. Yeah. So that's the reason that Heidegger is picking it, as well as perhaps the finitude lesson at the end of it is also perhaps interesting to him. Because never forget, for Heidegger, the finitude of man is an essential part of the meaning of being, and it's why he's not a to be is to be eternal Platonist. Nietzsche dislikes to be is to be eternal because he thinks that the changing and the apparent is the real, and that the unchanging eternals are abstractions and unreal and not alive, right? the part of that that Heidegger agrees with is he believes that existence, as human existence, as being alive, is the farthest thing from eternal, but that in no way prevents it from being the closest thing to being, right? So existence, as human existence, as finite existence, as being towards death even, is decidedly temporal and decidedly temporary, but not at all not being. Anyway, that I just wanted to bring out that note being there in the poem is the other reason that Heidegger likes it, right? He doesn't want to think that to be is to be eternal, because it would make mortal human life seem unreal, something like that. Okay. I wanted to point out that the void in abundance claim is all about particularity, individual being, right? So being is not just something general, it also has to be something particular. It has to be the individual being. And I want to point out that that's the same thing we saw back in being as idea in Plato. It was the same notion. We had a very general abstract formula, but that was exactly defining something like particularity. Now, in the case of the Platonic form of particularity, it's the form, which isn't as particular as what the scholastics would call the numerically identical, right? So if I have two exact copies of something, they have the same form, but I have a number one of them and a number two of them. They're numerically distinct, right? So anything that can be copied, there's a distinction between its formal essence and its numerical identity, so to speak. And the question of how it is with being with respect to those two things was exactly what the scholastics spent most of their time thinking about when they were thinking about what being means. They want to know if the being is the essence thing that the forms share, or is the numerical identity thing that is different for each of the copies of it. Which of those is the being? The Aristotelians want the material particular to be the original thing, so they want the being to be the thing which is numerically distinct about them. And the Platonists, for whom the being is the essence, want the form to be the thing which has the being, which is the thing which is the same across the numerical instances, not the thing which is different across the material, the instances. So the Platonists and the Aristotelians are going to disagree about how essential the form or the numerical identity is to the being of the thing. That's the stuff that the scholastics, when Duns Scotus and Aquinas are going out at hammer and tongs, that's the kind of subject that they're debating. That to them is the question of being as we will get to when we get to Gilson. To what degree is it essentiality, and to what degree is it something like material particularity? And you can see how that is also related to the question of particularity in time. The material particular that is different in each of the instances is clearly the part that's in time, and the essence that's the same across of them is almost like the mathematical form of them, which is kind of outside time. So to what degree time and instantiation and individuality are related. Anyway, just pointing out that in his Being as Void in Abundance chapter, it might sound like these are things which he's bringing up for the first time that no one else in philosophy thought about. Not true, right? We'll get tons of it in Gilson when we get to that. Okay. Were there other things in that last chapter that were questionable to you? Silence. If not, then I'm going to go to the last few paragraphs of it because
I have a question. I'm sorry, I had my mute on.
Okay, go,
I
Brian.
have a question.
Yes.
He says here at one point, it's on page 195, that in the culture, that in earlier periods, there were, well, here, I'll just read it. The essential consequence of this situation is revealed in the fact that historical decisions are now consciously, willfully, and totally transferred from separate areas like politics, science, art, and society into the realm of Weltanschauung. So can you explain that?
Yes. So this is almost where I was going next, but he's trying to explain that we are now living in the era of Nietzschean consummate subjectivity, and consummate subjectivity when people don't even know they're being Nietzschean anymore and have forgotten all about Nietzsche. They're just thinking about everything having to do with metaphysics and philosophy as different worldviews and different values, competing values even. But they think of those competing values as the worldviews and priorities of different philosophies that are themselves thought of less as philosophical doctrines and more as armed camps. There is no longer a doctrine of science, art, or society. There is the communist view of science, art, and society, and the capitalist view of science, art, and society, and the socialist view of science, art, and society, and so on, right? Every one of these fields is cross-cut by which camp are you talking about? Which ideology are you talking about? And every one of those ideologies will have its own view of each of these areas, and the difference between which camp is looking at it will be way more important than whether or not they're talking about science or art or society, right? So he's saying the driving thing is which ideology or worldview does it fit into, and everybody knows that all of those ideologies and worldviews are comprehensive explanations of everything that are set up to advance the interests and the power of specific groups. And they even think of them as instruments of the interests and power of those specific groups. They think that that's what thought is. Thought about these areas is thought to be always already the expression of the interests and power desires of this or that political group or cultural group, whatever. And that way of thinking about it is what he's calling in shorthand Weltanschauung. The worldview controls everything. The ideology controls everything, and everything else is thought of as just the expression of the interests of those who share that worldview, right? So the fundamental question about anything is, what church does it belong to? Where by church we mean worldview. And by worldview we mean fundamental philosophical doctrine and ideology constructed around it, right? The dialectical materialists have their communist doctrine, and they construct a group of the people who adhere to that doctrine that expresses the interests of a particular class, and they understand every single one of these other areas in terms of that. And they're not the only ones doing that. Everybody is doing that. There's just different versions of those camps. So that's what he's talking about, and he's saying that that is the result of, all historical decisions are now thought of that way, and that's the same as saying all of these people have the Nietzschean view of truth. They're all viewing truth as a legislated will to power for a particular set of interests. And that's why they think of all these things as just conflicts of interests between camps. So the interests of camps' view of all intellectual matters is the post-Nietzschean view, in the sense that Nietzsche prepared it, and now they can completely forget their Nietzscheanism and just be power politicians. Because all Nietzsche taught them was the power politics of your interests are determining everything you think about everything. So that's what he's calling, the standard paraphernalia for interpretation of the world in terms of Weltanschauung. We think of all these things as ideas and values. Ideas are just the constellated, weaponized memes of this or that, value, this or that camp, this or that interest. So what he's saying is that all of this, testifies the thoroughly metaphysical character of the age. the which philosophical doctrine camp you're in determines all your views on everything that previously was thought of as politics, science, art, or society.
Is he offering ontology as an alternative to metaphysics?
Partly. He did call what he did in Being in Time fundamental ontology. He also says something more like fundamental ontology dictates that the methods of being in time are sounder than the methods of previous metaphysics. But how much of an alternative is it? It's partly just an attempt to understand this whole history as being not one view of things, but a history, right? So he's not offering alternative in the sense of, here's my ideology, which is set up this other way, and it tickets and sorts everything in the same way as any other ideological view. Instead, he's giving you more like a understanding of why ideologies and changing ideologies and only differences of ideology is what you get when you're done thinking of these things as notions of truth, and you're thinking of them as just different interests. And you're going to do that as soon as your actual understanding of truth is you think that truth is a subjective projection of the drives of the people who think it. As soon as you decide that truth is fundamentally relative and subjective, you're going to think that it's all just the motives, drives, and unconscious yearnings of the people who think it. And that means you're going to interpret all of it as their interest. So he's saying that the ideological armed camps division view of the world is itself a consequence of viewing truth as fundamentally subjective. Is he offering ontology as an alternative to that? Yes, in the sense that he thinks that studying ontology can teach you where that notion of truth came from, and can teach you the fact that it is a historical thing that arises for historical reasons at a definite time. It isn't always there. It wasn't always there before. And its apparent necessity is just the result of a particular epoch in the history of metaphysics. Right? Now, can you get out of it by just studying ontology? He's not claiming that. This is some of the claims that he might have advanced earlier that Jim rather noted he backed off of, right? He says people will continue to think metaphysically well into the future. But what he is claiming is if we view all this as a sphere in which human thought and human decisions determine it, then in principle it's changeable. In principle, if people thought about truth differently, if they had a different relation to being and a different notion of truth, they would not view truth in these areas as simply a reflection of their interests, and therefore they would not think of all these things as just functions of the interests of which armed camp. Right? So he is holding out the prospect that that is something which human thought could change. But when I say human thought could change it, it would be up to thinkers in the future thinking differently for it to actually change. He can't make it change by wanting it to change. I think people have to actually think differently about these things in the future. Good question. And that's going to bring us to, the stuff in the next section is going to be about nihilism in terms of the history of being, where the fundamental question is going to be, does Nietzsche manage to get out of nihilism? Does Nietzsche's understanding of nihilism result in something which, if we follow Nietzsche's, directives on it, results in us getting out of nihilism, or does it, precipitate us into it? And he's going to claim something much more like the latter, right? If we're going to get out of nihilism, it's not going to be by being convinced Nietzscheans, he's going to claim. It might be by noticing something that Nietzsche helps us understand about how historical all this is, and maybe how optional all this is, but it's not going to be by being thoroughgoing Nietzscheans. Thoroughgoing Nietzscheans are in nihilism. he'll even claim we get to page 200. This isn't part of the reading so far, but that what Heidegger calls nihilism is the kind of thinking that thinks that there is nothing to being. Yeah, so the historical configuration of thought in which there is nothing to being and being doesn't matter is nihilism. In Heidegger's, not Nietzsche's sense. But we'll get to all that in the next one. Looking ahead, we're going to have one more section, which is like 50 odd pages on this final essay, which is exactly about how to assess. In a way, we've pulled back. There were some bigger claims in the part we just got through about the ontological difference and history of thought and so forth. Then we'll get to in the next section. But the next section is going to give us an assessment of Nietzsche's philosophy and how Nietzsche's philosophy relates to something like European nihilism or the age of metaphysics, and whether or not it is possible to exit the age of metaphysics, and if so, whether Nietzsche is the prescription for exiting the age of metaphysics or not. So as a final pronouncement on where Heidegger comes down on Nietzsche, that's sort of what you're getting here. It's less about the reasons why he's doing that and more about where he's coming out on it. The reasons got deeper in the part we just finished, if I can put it that way. Then you'll get in the last part. And then after that, we'll have one more session where we want to sum up everything that we've done on volume 3 and 4. So I think that this is this would normally be a 3-weeker, but I'm actually on vacation from the 23rd through the 30th. So I would suggest we do this one on the 1st. That would be 4 weeks from now, because we got to do either 2 or 4, just for when I'm away. But I could do the 1st if others could do the 1st.
I'm good with either one of those days, but given the fact that my comprehension and my actual practice has been to pretty much do all the readings in the last 4 days before meeting, I'm perfectly open to doing it on the 18th.
Okay. Jim?
October?
We're either doing it in 2 weeks on the 18th of October or in 4 weeks on the 1st of November. You can vote for either
I think
one.
we can do it on the 18th.
Okay.
Okay. Do we know
Brian?
about the missing Pete? Does he have a view?
We're going to go with what we decide here, and Pete will have to roll with the punches. But Brian, do you have a preference between 18th and 1st?
Well,
it's just 51 pages. 18th works for you. Okay, let's go for the 18th then. So we'll do the 18th, and the reading is just part 2. Nihilism is determined by the history of being, page 199 through 250 inclusive. 51 pages.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I want to take a short break, and then I want to get to you guys specific questions. So I'm going to pause the recording for a second and be back in like 3 minutes, top of the hour.
I have to excuse myself. My family just arrived for dinner.
No problem. I hope this was good, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
Bye.
All right, so we'll let Brian go, and we'll be back in 3 minutes or 2 minutes for questions. Hello. I have a drink. Not only a drink, but an actual adult beverage.
Yeah, I tried to stock up in advance and have stockpile.
You have a stockpile of adult beverage?
Yeah, I have. There's things I found on online advertising. A little refrigerator things, exactly the size of a single can, and 12-ounce can, and it keeps it cold for like up to an hour. You can't do that if you set it out on a shelf. So a cold can into little little device that I keep in the freezer when it's empty, and it holds it. So 2 of those in a row goes 2 hours, no problem.
I see.
Heidi ho.
Hello.
Hi. Well,
So we're back to recording.
I can't talk I can't stay as long as I want to. We were supposed to have a dinner guest at 5:30 was what I was told. Now I'm being told it's 5.
Gotcha. Okay.
So if you have to take a shower.
Well, we can go another half hour, and that's fine. Or so.
Okay. Questions?
Yes.
I was wondering, I've heard, you pick this up sort of in conversation. People shout at each other, but they claim, that's your truth. My truth is blah, blah. This sounds like what we just discussed. People claiming that I have truth and you have different truth, and somehow that's a lot of this behind the sort of critical Marxist or critical racism view. Seems to be that, but and they call it critical Marxism, but it sounds pretty much more like just Nietzsche, straight Nietzsche.
Fair. I mean, so the point of contact is people like Theodor Adorno, who was a Marxist who was influenced by Nietzsche, right? I mean, obviously Marx was not influenced by Nietzsche because he precedes it, right? And Nietzsche was, consciously, being anti-Marx, right? He was, if Marx was going to emphasize all of the elements of material causation in the sense of economic forces and so forth, Nietzsche was emphasizing all of the psychological and spiritual forces, so to speak, while still, what they both have in common is they're both saying that there are forces which are not simply rational, driving history in a way that Hegel would not have expected. But for Marx, those are fundamentally the economic forces, and the intersubjective, and for Nietzsche, they're spiritual, psychological, and inside the subject forces. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I think primarily the point of contact, what they have in common, and why they sort of call themselves, where they label themselves.
Sorry, I was just talking about first of all just Marx and Nietzsche, and then I was going to get to Adorno, who tries to put them together. But so far I'm just on Marx and Nietzsche. I'm not talking about the moderns, right? But right. First of all, the point is there's already something in common between Marx and Nietzsche, which is they're both reacting to Hegel and claiming that Hegel has too rational a view of the world, right?
Right.
But Marx is trying to emphasize the intersubjective, material, interested, economic ways in which history is not simply rational because it's a story of struggle, whatever, and struggle, economic struggle. Nietzsche is also emphasizing the ways in which history is not simply rational, but because of reasons which, instead of being between people, are within people, are psychological, and that are in the register that would previously be called the spiritual, right? The intellectual. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. The one point of commonality is just that they both have adopted this originally French idea of the social classes. But Marx had it as a worker versus boss type of social class. The French had it as the rulers versus the taxpayers social class, taxpayers. And the Nietzsche seemed to have the idea of people having different power centers. Those that have more successful and they're willing and setting up the structure that everybody else lives under.
But that was also an older view of social class that wasn't economic, right? The idea that
it's not economic. It's not economic. It's not economic.
Joe, let me finish, right? The point is the view that class is fundamentally economic is a specifically Marxian view. It's not the old view.
Right.
The previous version of social class had, the biggest one was the nobles and the commons, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And the idea that the nobles and the commons have fundamentally different, attitudes, interests, etc., was something you find in Montesquieu, for example, right? And there are plenty of philosophies of history that were based upon the different views of the classes, where the classes were not economic, right? And Marx is adapting that way of thinking, which is already there in people like Montesquieu and Heidegger and so forth, to specifically economic classes, right? So that's already an adaptation in Marx. But I'm trying to finally get forward from these guys to Adorno, right? Adorno is someone who is, reading Nietzsche while he is already trained in Marx, and he's a leftist Marxist, but it's quite clear to him that Nietzsche understands the cultural and social forces in history far better than Marx does. Mm-hmm. Marx had a kind of dismissive view of that whole sphere of things as being superstructural and an epiphenomena of class interest, right? It was, you know, in his writings in the German ideology, for example, you know, the claim is that the class interests determine the structure of the thought of the members of that class, and they're all, you know, reflections of the interests of that class, right? That's too superficial for Adorno, and too superficial for the reasons along the lines of what, you know, Nietzsche has explained. So Adorno thinks that Nietzsche understands cultural history, and therefore the social stuff that's influenced by cultural history and the whole realm of the humanities, so to speak, far better than Marx does, right? But he's still trying to take all that in a fundamentally Marxist direction. So the modern left identitarians are influenced by the thought of people like Adorno and people who are influenced by Adorno who tried to put those together. Another one.
Is that Ted or Adorno?
Yes.
Ted or.
Yes. Minimum Morality is probably his best book. But another person in a similar vein who is less influenced by Nietzsche directly and instead is influenced by Freud and therefore only indirectly by Nietzsche is someone like Herbert Marcuse, right? Mm-hmm. And he's trying to, in the same way that Adorno is putting together Nietzschean understanding of culture with Marx. That's what Adorno is doing. Marcuse is trying to put together a Freudian understanding of you know, social dynamics, so to speak, with Marxism, and I think way more superficially than Adorno. I think Adorno is a fundamentally deeper thinker and all that kind of stuff. But both of them are thought of as Frankfurt School thinkers who are in the same vein of they've been influenced by Nietzsche, but they're still fundamentally you know, leftist Marxist influenced intellectuals in the 20th century. Okay, so what does all that have in common? It's you have a kind of the same interested classes view that you had in Marx's notion of ideology or Marx's notion of superstructure, but now informed by Nietzsche's understanding of moralities themselves as reflecting this kind of legislative power of the propounders of philosophies, right? So there's a sense in which Nietzsche has identified a more interesting place in which future legislation is written in the moral doctrines of the philosophers, right? And that's part of what Adorno is, you know, seeing, agreeing with, and wants to colonize / capture / you know, turn into something that Marxist intellectuals can be more awake about instead of being ham-fisted and dumb about it, right? Okay, and that gives you all these things which later turn into slicing identity by categories other than class, right? Which is, again, an attempt to be more sophisticated about the notion of interest determining patterns of thought than Marx was, because Marx was way too unidimensional, reducing that to economics and class. The other place that this comes in from is relativism in anthropology in particular. So Nietzsche had an enormous influence on through the notions of cultural relativism on thinking in anthropology and the human sciences related to anthropology. This includes people like Levi-Strauss in France, others in the 20s and 30s, and you know, later, you know, people in the 70s like Clifford Geertz. But what all of it is, there's people that were inclined towards cultural relativism anyway because they were students of the differences between cultures, and they found a philosophy of relativist difference of thought in Nietzsche, right? So they would be inclined to see not class interests or classes other than the intellectual one or moralities like you get from Nietzsche, but instead cultures in the sense of both ethnic differences and differences in ethnic levels of development, right? The way primitive peoples think, the way the Trobriand Islanders think, the way that the Pygmies think, as opposed to, or the way the Brazilian Amazon Indians think, right? And trying to understand those structurally, right? So all of those are different ways in which this human variety of thought stuff met Nietzsche, and Nietzsche was saying each philosopher's notion of truth is their legislative and enacting of what they, you know, their categorical way of thinking is their way of enacting what matters to them, and thus achieving what is necessary for them in a kind of interested way. If you put that together with enough Marxism, the interest becomes way less philosophical and way more material, right? Becomes interest in money and power, right? But money and power-seeking interests differentiated by the ethnicity, identity, psychology, and class of the people doing it, right, gets you this modern melange, right? But so large parts of that are from Marx, large parts of that are from Nietzsche, and some of them come from these intervening characters like Adorno. They also come from just the general persuasiveness of relativism in the age, so to speak, which is mostly coming from Nietzsche, but not entirely from Nietzsche. So anyway, that's the sort of intellectual precursors of all that. Now there are more or less sophisticated versions of that, and you get some postmodernists who know all this stuff well, and they know Heidegger as well, as opposed to just the Nietzsche. But most of that is coming straight from Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, through these intervening thinkers, and occasionally disciplines like anthropology. Does that help?
Yes, very much. Thank you very much. I just have a little Adorno on Wikipedia. He didn't seem to do much writing before the 50s and 60s.
True, and he was one of these Jewish exiles from Germany who he had been an academic in Germany in the 20s and early 30s, but he had to flee. And then I think he was a while at the New School in New York, and then did most of his writing as an exile in the U.S. in the post-war period.
Wikipedia mentions the Heidelberg School, which apparently is where he started from before he fled Germany. And I don't know anything about the Heidelberg School except his name keeps coming up in these regards.
Well, it was where Heidegger himself was teaching.
I thought he was teaching at a university. Oh, the Heidelberg.
Yes.
Well, he was in Heidelberg. Okay, he was all at Heidelberg. But
Heidelberg was the university, but he's usually thought of as Frankfurt School, but different story. But yeah, but sorry, James. Jim, do you have questions? Because I know you got time limits. You got 15 minutes.
Yeah, yeah, we're not going to go deep into that. I just was wondering.
What are we not going to go deep into?
I was asking him as we went too, so that I think I'm pretty good, except I guess I wanted to dig in more about why he didn't willfully misinterpret Plato.
Sorry, you're asking you're asking how willful his misinterpretation of Plato is? Yes. I don't think it's willful. I think he has there are parts of Plato that he understands a little bit superficially, but the visuality part, the nuances of that are okay. He's fundamentally right that Plato is thinking about this. He's thinking of being his idea in the sense of the outward appearance of the thing. He just doesn't go into what that outward appearance actually means and why it issues in the notion of definition. That's just because he's not a Platonist. He hasn't thought about the thing like a Platonist would think about the thing. He's way more influenced by, that is, Heidegger is way more influenced by people like Aristotle and Aquinas in the Aristotelian tradition than he is by the Platonist tradition. He also is way more of an, if I can put it this way, a language and auditory thinker rather than a visual and image thinker. That's why he's always on the way to language, so to speak. He's hearing notes in the tones of words very subtly, and that can make him a good reader of the notion of aletheia, or a good reader of even the notion of idea. But he's not thinking of it in the same sort of the definition of the thing is the surface of the thing, is the physical limits of the thing, is the outer envelope surface of the solid, right? He's not thinking of essence that way, in the way that Plato clearly is. But the parts about the being stuff, I don't think that's willful at all. I think that's the very, very far from being willful. I think he cannot conceive a schema in which being is not the highest question, right? Even if someone is directly presenting one where being is a subordinate question and good is the highest question, he cannot think that, because to him being is the highest question, right? He doesn't have an above of being, and he cannot reorder that scheme. It may be that he doesn't think that scheme should be reordered. That's a different question. But he very clearly just cannot, because Plato tells him directly. And by this, here I'm talking about something which is beyond being, and he says, "Oh, it's beyond beingness, so it must be being." Just flat. I tell you, X is beyond being. You say it's beyond beingness. Okay, so if beyond beingness, you mean being, because that's the thing I've got, which is beyond beingness. There were plenty of Platonists, Neoplatonists in particular, and medieval Neoplatonists, who went even farther with the scheme. They had being, and beyond it they had good, and some people put the one beyond the good as opposed to at the same level of the good, which is the usual way of thinking about it. And some people put the nothing beyond the one. You had some people that had the scheme of nothing, one, good, being, where being is fourth. I'm serious, right? These were, and all that got into their actual theologies as well, and whether or not they had a negative theology. You cannot predicate of God things other than the nothing, because everything you predicated of him is false, right? So it's the unthinkable, so it's the nothing. And of all the names of God, the least misleading is nothing. That's a typical thing you find, like Scotus Regina in Middle Ages Ireland, right?
Well, when you first laid out and explained the Plato idea of good being above being, yes. I was immediately thinking, oh, well, that's where the Christians get it.
It is where the Christians
God
get it.
is above. Yeah, I thought so. And
but hang on. I mean, so to be clear, right? Not to be clear, the traditional Jewish understanding of theology puts God and being as almost equivalent, right? Because I am that I am is the name of God in the Old Testament, right? So the original theology had being and God with an equal sign between them, right? Mm-hmm. But the Neoplatonists had a good that was above being, right? And they influenced through Plotinus influenced Origen, a Neoplatonist, Platonist, early Christian thinker, church father, and that in turn influenced Augustine. And people debate about Augustine, whether or not he what he did with that. Most people think that Augustine decided that because Plato put the good above being, he wasn't in line enough with the Old Testament to be a Christian in the matter, and wanted to equate them again. But that's a debatable question about Augustine. But the point is, there's still plenty of variety before Augustine and all that, and people go into their, is someone following the being theology or the good theology, as they talk about each of these church fathers, right? Right. And they're perfectly sensible questions to ask. It is certainly not the case that they're all in agreement on the subject. It is certainly not the case that if a Christian theologian therefore has this view about the relationship between being and the good, nothing like it. You get variety.
Okay, I have gathered through secondary or tertiary reading that one point of view that's very strong in Islam is the idea that everything happens in the mind of God, instant to instant. It's called infantilism or something.
No, occasionalism.
How does this fit in? Whatever it's called. How does this relate to being? It seems to me that this is more like a Jewish equivalent.
We will get to that in Gilson, but the fundamental thought behind occasionalism is trying to deny that there is anything like a natural necessity that could constrain God, right? The occasionalists, which were it's a doctrine that was founded among the Asherite theologians first, and which you also find in William of Ockham in the West. The fundamental thought of it is that the philosophers who believe in a natural necessity are believing that certain things are impossible because nature requires X. There's some necessity of causation requiring constraining the future possibility, and they regard that as derogating from the omnipotence of God, right? So in order for God to be truly omnipotent, God cannot be constrained by any necessity. Therefore, what could happen at the next instant could be changed from all past apparent necessity simply because God willed it to be so, right? And that means they want to deny that any supposed natural necessity has the actual character of necessity, and they'll just say that's one of God's habits, right? So everything we would call nature, they would just call a habit up till now of God. And this exact argument was used by Hume to deny the possibility of natural causality on skeptical grounds. The skeptical arguments of Hume against natural causality are found almost verbatim in the Asherite theologians, right? So they're with the same target. The target is the idea that there could be philosophers who know something of a natural necessity that tells them that some subsequent event is a necessary consequence of a previous state of the world, right? So their target, both of them, is the possibility of rational knowledge of nature sufficient to make the future of the world necessarily predictable with the necessity of a conclusion in logic, right?
What's the clearest example in the things that we have looked at or will look at that simply says occasionalism is wrong?
Well, anyone or anything who believes that there is knowledge of any possible necessity believes that occasionalism is wrong, right? If rational knowledge of any causality is possible, then occasionalism is wrong. And by the way, Humean skepticism is also wrong, right? But Descartes thinks that that's possible. Descartes thinks that God cannot convince him that he does not exist, right? Kant thinks even that are in the realm of the domain of mathematical physics, the understanding is knowledgeable enough that you can have certainty there. But anyone who is not a skeptic winds up rejecting occasionalism one way or another. But it's a skepticism for theologians founded on the idea of omnipotence rather than founding on the idea of unknowability.
Yeah.
Jim, you got four more minutes before we have to go shower. Maybe 10. I don't know how long it takes you to shower.
Actually, what I was just thinking when I heard that was, I wonder how that relates to open theism. Sounds like there's a bridge there somehow.
I don't know open theism well enough. But
open theism, yeah, just that we don't have enough time to go into that. It's basically that God limits, I didn't know if there was a connection there. It sounds to me like, okay, maybe that's the Christian version of occasionalism. I don't know.
The Christian version of occasionalism you find directly in William of Ockham. I mean, William of Ockham is just a straight. He's a nominalist and a skeptic about natural understanding. He wants the things which we think we know as natural facts, as opposed to logical facts or mathematical facts, to be uncertain, not certain knowledge, and you can only have confidence about them, and that confidence about them has the character of faith. And that's because they're you cannot know facts about the natural world that you know, wouldn't fall to an occasionalist kind of skeptical argument, so to speak. So William of Ockham wants there to be human certainty only in logic and mathematics, and outside of that, all human knowledge to be contingent and dependent upon a faith. Right? That's the typical position of a, you know, a nominalist skeptic of the late Middle Ages. And again, all of that founded on, you know, skeptical arguments that are occasionalist arguments, basically, omnipotence of God arguments. But we will get to some of those things in Gilson, by the way, because Gilson is quite good on a lot of these, where those kinds of positions and questions touch upon the doctrine of being that those people had. It will be there in Gilson, right? Like you'll find Averroes there, you'll find you know, the Neoplatonists there. You know, if they're in that history and they have a view on what existence means, then Gilson will talk about them. I had a different question, which is all the Plato stuff here new to people or familiar to people? Because I went into a little bit of depth on what the original Plato was to it that Heidegger was describing and reacting to, and some of that stuff about the interpretation of what he means by idea and why is, you know, clear to me from long enough study of Platonism, but might not be clear to everybody. But some of this stuff is just, you know, straight in the text of the Republic and just, you know, obvious to anyone who reads it. And I cannot tell how familiar any of that is to any of you guys, if it's all just completely, you know, completely unknown, you know, entirely virgin territory.
For me, it has to be treated as new information, because even though I have been exposed to Plato,
yeah,
that was 50 years ago, and I haven't read anything since. And it wasn't even depth research then; it was reading it because it's assigned.
Right.
And I picked it up through conversation, and I can already tell that I picked up a lot of untruth in other people's views.
Right. So the fact that it exceeds in age does not necessarily mean that it exceeds in dignity and power in this case.
No, in fact, my memory's faded.
I understand. But you're right that a lot of people do get views of Plato secondhand, which are fundamentally critical views of him to dismiss him for reason X or Y. And they've heard that without ever hearing the thing being rejected in its own terms. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Aristotle was always sold better to me, Jim.
I've been reading parts of the Republic again, like same, but been a while, and it was pretty apparent to me. I was happy because, well, I hate to say this because now I feel like an idiot. I feel like I'm a product of my age because I want Plato to win. I wanted to crush Heidegger, right? So I could see that, yeah, you know, and so. Because I was explaining to Jason, it was a lot more inspiring to me. And I saw the Calliclean view that was pretty much adopted like verbatim by Nietzsche. And I thought that he got destroyed in, what was it, Book 8 of the Republic? Or Book 7?
Callicles himself gets destroyed in the Gorgias rather than the Republic, because he's not in the Republic.
Okay.
But Thrasymachus has similar views and he gets destroyed in Book 1 of the Republic. But Callicles himself appears in the Gorgias and is dealt with there. But the same, the justice is the advantage of the stronger view is put forward by both of them. Most directly in those terms in the Book 1 of the Republic by Thrasymachus, and it's a different version of it, but similar in the Gorgias, where Callicles objects to all of the easygoing conventional agreements that Socrates is able to wring out of Gorgias's less full-throated students, so to speak. And Callicles just, you know, disdainfully dismisses all the things that he thinks he has proved by saying, you know, but this is absurd. You can't possibly actually believe this, you know, this tripe that you're peddling, Socrates. You know, everybody knows, and he puts forth Thrasymachus' thesis again, basically. And then Socrates has to wrestle with that, and he gives certain arguments which maybe convince other people, but certainly don't convince Callicles. And then having been reduced to, you know, Callicles just abusing him, he resorts to telling him a myth about the afterlife. and the condition of the of people in the afterlife, which Callicles also doesn't find terribly convincing. So Callicles is famously one of the people that Socrates confronts in the Platonic dialogues, who he does not convince, right? There's lots of other people who he does convince. He wrings some concessions from Callicles. All the concessions wrung from Callicles happen because Callicles does not want to displease Gorgias, his teacher. So he agrees. He agrees for the sake of argument, not even for the sake of argument, for the sake of not being abused by Gorgias for being unreasonable. That's the only reason he agrees. But in the end, he does want the approval of Gorgias, and Gorgias demands that he appear reasonable, and so he agrees to some things which result in him as his past views being contradicted. But it's quite clear that it's all dragged kicking and screaming out of him, and he doesn't believe it. Anyway, that's just Callicles. But the actual opinion of Callicles is very simple. It's the typical cynical one of what people actually think is good is power, reputation, etc. Justice, it's useful to appear just, it's not useful to be just. And everyone, everyone who actually tries to be just is just a patsy serving the interests of others instead of themselves, right? That's the fundamental Calliclean view. And there certainly are elements of that in Nietzsche, although Nietzsche is way less conventionalist than Callicles is about what is good. The part that they agree on is that power is part of the good. Sorry, you were talking about reading Plato, and you want Plato to win even over Heidegger.
Yeah, and I don't want it to be because, well, I realize I'm a product of my age talking about things getting politicized.
Yes.
But it's not for politics. For me, it's just that it moves me, and it's profound.
Got
and
it.
then when I,
you find Plato moving and convincing, and the places where Heidegger gets your agreement anyway strike you as, aw shucks, I had to go along with that because he made a good argument. Whereas when Plato is winning, you're like, rah rah, my team is scoring the touchdown, and it sounds great. Yes? No? Yeah. I mean, just, we can be honest.
Yes. No, exactly. And I'm fighting that. I've also had it in socials. Like recently I had a discussion with somebody and brought up, like not trying to be contrarian or start an argument, just mentioned about Plato and, the history of philosophy. Yes. And they got really angry because they said I was neglecting the African contribution and Plato stole it from Africa. And I'm like, okay, I wasn't trying to step into an argument about identity politics. This was mentioned. And then, so now I'm just kind of on a mission to be like, did he not speak the truth? Who cares if he got it from somebody else? That's how we got it. Be glad that he delivered it. We wouldn't be talking about this right now if it hadn't been for him. So what's the problem? We wouldn't be able to do a retroactive morality check on who got it first if it hadn't been for them.
But if someone cares less about the content of the thought than on who said it, it's because they don't care about the thought, right? It's a fight over status or power, and the participants in the history are only proxies for themselves according to what they identify with, right? It's an entirely vicarious touching on thought, right? Whereas the reality is thought is exactly that which can reproduce itself freely in the sense of without constraint and also without cost in any mind that can think it, right? That's what's characteristic of thought, is that it reproduces itself for free in anyone who can think it. And that's what makes it thought. And if it's the people who think that those things are fundamentally about identity are denying that thought in that translatable sense exists, right? That they think that what can be translated is not real, something like that, because they're thinking that in Nietzsche's terms, the body in its great reason is not translatable, and the part that is translatable is superficial, something like that, which is to deny that the commonality of thought across people exists. So to me, civilization is the idea that that one conversation of translatable thought does exist. And to me, it's quite clear that it does, because I can go read people from entirely alien cultures and entirely alien times, and it is some effort to understand them as they understood themselves, but I can. So anyone who says that it's not possible, the actual proves possible. I've done it. You can't tell me otherwise.
Okay, well, I guess I got to go. It's 20 to 5.
Sure, we'll let you go. And
Yeah, I haven't taken a shower yet.
Sorry?
I haven't even taken a shower yet.
Yes. We will let you take a shower. So 2 weeks, we will do the last essay, and then it'll probably be sometime in it could be as early as, depending on what we decide then, it could be as early as November 1 that we finish up with our wrap session.
That'd be cool.
Not in the sense of rhyming diction, but in the sense of putting a bow on it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this is good. Thanks, everybody. And any last questions from you, Joe, before we ring off?
No. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to 2 weeks from now.
All right. All right. Take care. I'll stop recording. See ya.